Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the slight delay. stop.
Ano kasi tapat ka sa may speaker? Tingnan mo, tabi yung saan kung ano na yung parang mag-feedback. Ayan, meron. Try mo nga. Meron. Ayan. Meron. Oh, 1, 2. Ayan, 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. Ayan, 1, 2. 1, 2.
Ladies and gentlemen, once again, we apologize for this slight delay. We will begin the symposium in about 5 minutes. Thank you.
My name is Marga Binamira. I'm going to be your moderator for this morning, and would like to really welcome everyone back to day 2 of this fabulous symposium. Brevity, always good. Yesterday was an incredible day of lectures, and I'm sure you will all agree that the exhibit ongoing in support of these lectures are fabulous. They're fantastic. Today promises to be just as interesting, and we have 4 speakers today. The first one being Ms. Liliana Ortolia Baird. Ms. Liliana Ortolia Baird is originally from Down Under. She was born in Australia and read English and art history at Melbourne University. She finished postgraduate studies at London University and has worked as an editor and publisher, most recently as publisher of illustrated books with the Hachette UK group. Her interests lie in map and travel publishing and the use of maps in teaching geography in the 18th century. Since 2013, Liliana has been the editor of the IMCOS journal and has done a fabulous job. She is also on the editorial board of the History of Cartography journal, the Imago Mundi. Today, Liliana is here to talk to us about a lady's visit to Manila and Japan, Ana Dalmeida, a modern tourist in the Far East. Without further ado, please welcome Ms. Liliana Ortolia Baird.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for being here, and Rolf, thank you for accepting this submission. A lady's visit to Manila and Japan fell into my lap. Some time ago, I mentioned to a friend that the 36th Symposium was a joint affair between Hong Kong and Manila. And he said, I've got just the thing for you. And he handed me a copy of a book that I had never heard of. In fact, most people haven't heard of it, apart from those perhaps who are in the know in the Philippines. Indeed. Not many. Hands up in those? One? Okay, 2. Okay, so that's how this particular presentation came about. When you put a picture together, you have broad brushstrokes. And you have little details, incidentals. And the subject of today's presentation is one of those incidentals. Anna's book is a minor work, but it adds a little humanity and 3 dimension to our understanding of 19th century Manila. So on that note, let's begin. I have to set up. Okay. In 1863, the London publishing house of Hurst and Blackett published an account of the tour of the Far East made by a young Englishwoman called Ana Dalmeida, who only signs her name as Anna D', possibly out of modesty. To preface, A Lady's Visit to Manila and Japan is an idiosyncratic travel narrative in which the author flits from subject to subject like a butterfly choosing the brightest colour flower. She darts from boa constrictors by way of a museum to buffalo milk, before settling for a long draft on colonial taxes. She peppers her personal observations with historical and geographical snippets, which she has largely sourced from earlier publications, of which there were many by the 1860s. She includes anecdotes and local stories and transcribes dialogues which she has heard while on her travels. As an editor, I would have probably returned her manuscript with a note advising to restructure. But then again, it would have probably lost all of its charm and quirkiness. Her book was well received and applauded in The Spectator, the London Morning Post. Hold on. It's not quite doing what we want it to do. Her book was well received and applauded in The Spectator, the London Morning Post, and amongst others, the Straits Times in Singapore. It was reviewed as, quote, a picturesque and animated account with information recorded in so an agreeable manner not found in other volumes. In describing her work as a seafaring vessel, a pleasure craft in which to while away in light amusement, Anna signals the changing attitude of travellers. The scholarly intentions of earlier travels on their grand tour have been eclipsed by pleasure-seeking collectors of sights, and the more picturesque the better. Anna was one of the growing number of travellers amongst the leisured class who were attracted to far-flung exotic destinations made easier with the advent of the steamship, to whom the label we can apply tourist. Following conventions deemed appropriate for a female writer of the Victorian period, Anna assures her reader that her work is not a scientific, ethnographical, or historical disquisition. Her narrative would not stray into the public and professional domain of the male travel writer. She promises to stay within the private and personal sphere. You can't trust anybody, you can't trust what people write. So, yet despite her modesty and self-deprecation and claiming insufficient knowledge to assume, quote, the office of public instructor, Anna does not hold back from expressing her opinions, and without hesitation plunges into subjects which are far outside the female sphere: prison reform, tax, the oppression of Eastern women, and social injustices. She writes critically on those traditions and practices she disapproves of in her host countries, and the Catholic Church is the recipient of her most vehement censure. The title of Anna's book is misleading, for Manila and Japan are just two of several more destinations she visits in the course of her 6-month-long tour. So, on this map, we can see she starts off in Singapore, goes to Hong Kong, Macau, Canton, across to Manila, back to Hong Kong, up to Shanghai, Nagasaki, Yokohama, and then basically travels the way back to Hong Kong. I would like to suggest that a lady's visit to Manila in Japan was only one part of a much more extensive voyage. Firstly, her husband published in 1864, a year after her book, a 2-volume account of their travels in Java. Secondly, throughout her narrative, Anna makes many comparative references to other places she has visited, such as Malta, Alexandria, Cairo, the pyramids, and Calcutta. These were all destinations on the overland route to India, and it would appear that Anna, with her husband William Barrington d'Almeida and their 1-year-old daughter Rosa, joined a peninsular and oriental steamship in 1861 for Alexandria. As the Suez Canal had not yet been built, they travelled in part overland from Cairo to Aden, where they boarded another steamship to complete their journey to Calcutta. Anna gives us no indication of the purpose of their travel. However, as her husband was born in Singapore of an Anglo-Portuguese family, with members scattered in Macau, Calcutta, and Singapore, it may have been an opportunity to introduce Anna as his new bride to his roots in the Far East. Anna made no visual record of her trip. Despite the seeming modernity of this young couple, they did not have a camera. But she relates an incident at a temple in Japan where she and her husband were photographed seated, somewhat irresponsibly I have to say, on the thumbs of the statue of Buddha. Sadly, this picture does not appear in the book. In fact, there are only 2 illustrations, a tedious frontispiece of Nagasaki and the other a vignette of a Japanese geisha that you saw on the title page. So, in the absence of any further visual documentation of her Far East experiences, this presentation, with the exhibition that Rolf has so finely put together, will attempt to give glimpses of what Anna recorded seeing and hearing in 1862. The constraint of time limits us to considering just a small portion of her trip, and being in Manila, it seems fitting we focus on this city. The family boarded the clipper Thunder in Singapore on the 2nd of March 1862, bound for Hong Kong. The journey took them 5 days. The screw-driven steamship featured in the London Illustrated News was under the command of Scotsman Captain Fowler. Passengers were few, but according to Anna, all were agreeable, and fun and merriment were plentiful. Below deck, the cargo was less agreeable. The clipper carried 3,612 chests of opium. But then again, keeping an empire afloat was costly, and revenues from opium until the 1880s helped to do so. After a brief sojourn in Hong Kong, the family embarked on the SS Pekin. Anna describes it as, quote, a kind of semi-man of war, a tub considerably less agreeable than the Thunder. The weather for the crossing was wretched, the boat dirty, the food greasy, the baby sick, the Chinese boy employed as their general factotum sick, but the cockroaches were in abundance. The journey across the South China Sea was completed in under 3 days. But unlike the passage from Singapore to Hong Kong, in which Anna recorded in considerable detail the islands and coastal profiles they pass, the Hong Kong-Manila leg went unmentioned. I wonder why. After the miserable crossing, Anna would have been relieved by the sight of the Pasig Lighthouse. The 16-metre white tower marked the entrance for the river for vessels looking to dock on the inland port of Manila. Her first impression of Manila is of the boat which ferries them to their disembarkation point. She approvingly wrote of it as, quote, a clean specimen of Manila handicraft, being scooped out of one entire trunk of teak wood, with a neatly constructed awning of matting, a nice sort of framework for our feet to rest on, so that in case water came in, we would not get our feet wet. So I'm imagining that they were probably being ferried on a little barca like this. There's the matting, and we can't see the framework for their feet, but I'm imagining that this is what they travelled in. Oh, going the wrong way. Yes. Her second impression was less favourable. Anna describes impatiently the burdensome bureaucracy of the customs official, which she suspects was just another indication of, quote, suspicious government, giving trouble to foreigners. She was not the only visitor who complained. German traveller Herr Jagor, visiting Manila between 59 and 60, wrote, quote, the ordeal of the custom house and the many formalities which the minor native officials exercised without any attempt at discretion appeared all the more wearisome to me when contrasted with easy routine of the English free ports of the East that I have just quitted. We might be saying this after breakfast when travelling into Ireland. While waiting for customs clearance, Anna would have had time to observe part of the city walls, and inside would have been Fort Santiago, the starting point of the defensive walls that encircled the city. On screen is Bussetta's map of the city as it stood in 1851. I must add that throughout her text, Anna never mentions consulting a map. A map never, ever arises in her text. Of the city's position, she notes that, quote, it was remarkably good, the sea on one side and the river on the other, with ditches well fortified on the land between. She would have also seen the dome of the cathedral, Bosetta's plan shows the layout of the Intramuros with 17 streets crossing at right angles, with the cathedral unusually placed not in the centre as one might expect. A clue to this peculiarity may be drawn from Philip II's instruction in 1573 regarding the design of Manila. The main church, he advised, should be, quote, be visible from the landing place, so Anna would have seen this, so that its structure may serve as a means of defence, to signal that the purpose of the settlement was to teach the infidels to know God and his laws. To visit the site of the Intramuros, Anna would have crossed the Puente Grande. Now, I know it's a very difficult image to see, but it was the only river crossing the Pasig River at that time. And she would have entered the city through one of its 6 gates, which she informs us in a manner of a guidebook, are, quote, are closed at an hour past midnight, and gentlemen and ladies frequenting late balls or parties are obliged to obtain a permit from the captain of the guard. All foreign visitors were guided to the principal square of the Intramuros, the Plaza Mayor. It was the seat of Spanish colonial power and contained the cathedral at the centre, flanked on either side of the official residence of the Spanish Governor-General and the town hall. This image was not the view Anna witnessed. This is to confuse you. The watercolour reflects what José Lozano saw in 1847, 5 years before the 1852 earthquake. The Baroque cathedral that we see in Lozano's illustration was one of the buildings seriously damaged by that event. Anna describes the neoclassical rebuild by architect Nicolas Valdés, completed in 1858 as, quote, very ordinary and heavy-looking, to which she adds further, are all the churches in Manila. The interior does not garner her favour either, for after being struck by a spectacle of dazzling silver, she discovers that the spectacle is nothing but thin plating. Anna's assessment of the buildings, the ecclesiastical buildings, is coloured by her antipathy for the Catholic Church, a sentiment which she reveals early in her text. About two or three pages into her account of Manila, she's already accusing the locals of being the most bigoted people she had ever met. She sternly disapproves of the wicked subterfuge of so-called miracles which she believes are designed to, quote, mislead incredulous inhabitants. She attributes their ignorance and lack of civilization to Catholic influences, while pointing out that those of the Protestant faith would favour, quote, industrial and intellectual pursuit, end quote. While on many fronts Anna writes with a surprising open-mindedness and sympathy, she also reveals herself as remarkably intolerant on religious matters, casting herself into the less appealing role of a Protestant missionary. I hope you can see something in this watercolour from the Zobel collection. One of Anna's first outings in Manila was to the Calzada, a broad tree-lined street where the well-to-do gathered in the early evening to promenade in carriages or on foot. It was to Manila what Hyde Park was to London. She described enthusiastically the music of the military bands, the small local ponies which she compared to those she had seen in Java, and comments that the generality of women wear neither bonnet nor hat for the evening promenade. But like the Dutch ladies in Java, they prefer to enjoy thoroughly the fresh air. In Anna's estimation, this was the gay world of Manila, decked out in colours, bright, radiant, and numerous as those of the rainbow. She does go very poetic from time to time. But it's this, the little quote on the side gives you some idea of the traffic that was that was visible on the evening. I mean, they had to have a policeman to conduct the traffic. The carriages had to definitely to go down one side and return on the other side. You couldn't shilly-shally in the middle. From her text, we could glean that the Calzada was a cultural area of the city. She approvingly mentions the theatre, gardens, a statue of Isabel II, and a monument to Magellan, which is depicted in this 1856 engraving. We can see it sort of prominent there, and this is in Henry Ellis's book of Manila and the Lakes of Luzon. All these aspects are, in her estimation, measures of civilization, and she goes on about civilization a great deal. Civilization is not being naked. Civilization is having statues and academies and museums. Lozano provides us with a clearer view of the monument as it was in 1847. The tall fluted column was crowned with an armillary inscribed with Magellan's name. Originally located just outside the northern walls of the Intramuros near the Puerta de Isabel II, it was moved when the Americans tore down parts of the wall to expand the wharves of the Pasig River in 1904. Sadly, like much of the city, it was a casualty of World War II. While Magellan's monument is a passing mention, Anna is more expansive on Isabel's statue. The reader learns that it was made by a distinguished sculptor named D. Ponciano Ponzano, I believe from Barcelona, or certainly Catalonia, at a cost of $10,000, and was sent from Cadiz in the Spanish vessel of Alavaza. She has this habit of giving really odd little bits of information that don't really don't lead you into an understanding of Manila, but nevertheless, she adds them in. And the pedestal is of dark Romblon marble and cost $5,000. When Isabel was deposed in 1868, the new Governor-General in Manila set on removing the remnants of the old regime, including Isabel's statue. The task of destroying the monument was ironically given to a supporter of the Spanish crown who had it removed to his house. The statue languished in a storeroom for almost 30 years before being moved in front of the Malate Church, where she remained until blown down by a typhoon in 1970. The monument was quickly erected for the visit of Prince Carlos of Spain in 1975, and I'm hoping to see it. Does anybody know where it is? Anyway. 19th century Filipino artists and European visitors have left a rich legacy of paintings of the island's inhabitants, about whom Anna keenly writes. Of the mestizo's clothes, Anna points out with some astonishment that he wears his shirt outside his trousers, and that this oddity is favored by the Spanish as a way of distinguishing them from other groups. As to their physical appearance, Anna declares that they are quite, quote, on the whole, a great improvement on the Tagalog, their features being generally so much better. She describes the women who in their daily life carry heavy weights, admiring how they walk with their loads so expertly balanced on their head. Anna is also fond of acting as a cultural interpreter, affecting a somewhat patronizing maternal attitude to those whom she perceives as victims of an uncivilized society. For instance, she proposes that poorer women favor wearing dark blue for the fact that they can wear it for longer, because light colors would require washing. So she makes these rather innocent assumptions, but it does color the 21st century reader about her character. Anna takes to task the Spanish government over the unfair taxation that is imposed on the Chinese, who she claims, quote, are universally disliked and laughed at. She sets out in her book the taxes paid by each racial group, the mestizo pays $1.50, the native $1, while, quote, the poor Chinamen are obliged to give up $3 each. Despite admitting to not liking certain of their character traits, the Chinese were, in her estimation, hard-working and in every branch of trade, quote, completely superseding the natives, who are more inactive and self-denying. The Catholic Church is also in for a whipping from Anna over their refusal to allow them to marry Christian women, which she then claims is responsible for their frightfully immoral lives. This gentleman in Lozano's illustration may have been one of those hard-working traders on the Escolta. This street was known for its concentration of immigrant merchants, mainly from China, who initially came to make their fortune during the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade. Anna describes the street as, quote, abounding with Chinese shops that present a very gay appearance, attended by indefatigable inmates, ever on the alert to the chance of turning a penny. I believe this is probably a characteristic that she didn't like about the Chinese. In the 19th century, the street was lined with shops and boutiques selling imported goods from China, Europe, and elsewhere in Latin America. Jean Mallet, in his 2-volume account of the Philippines published in 1846, records that amongst the foreign goods to be had on the Escolta were Gruyere cheese from Holland and olives and ham and fruit conserves from France. This view of Manila's retail centre was captured by one of the artists on Frederick Lütke's round-the-world expedition, carried out between 1826 and 29 on the behest of Tsar Nicholas I, and it's amongst the exhibition inside. A visit to a cigar factory was on the itinerary of every foreign visitor. The Fábrica de Puros, or Old Cigar Factory of the government, stood beside the Church of Binondo. I'm having to hazard a guess here, but it may have been one of these buildings here. But there will be people who know far more than I do who can correct me on this. The factory is a colonial government's entrepreneurial scheme of creating a monopoly on tobacco production in the late 18th century. The scheme became so lucrative that for the next 100 years it became a major source of revenue for the colonial government. Anna comments that her visit to the factory interested her greatly, and she enjoys describing the process and techniques for manufacturing cigars and cigarettes. Anna is also fond of quantitative facts. She advises readers that there were 10,000 women and 300 men employed at the factory, and the conditions that they worked under. She remarks on the slowness of their labour and contrasts their effort with the efficiency of mechanized Europe. She explains the distribution of labour between men and women, advising readers that men were, quote, currently employed in the manufacture of a new Havana-shaped cigar. This photo was taken in the late 19th century, so some 30 years after Anna's description, but I think it does bear quite a lot of resemblance to what she has written. When here on the screen, she talks about the women pounding the leaves with a stone the size of a lemon. And I think it may well be what was happening in this photograph. Observing that the native women all smoke, she footnotes mischievously, and she has a thing about the Spanish, she footnotes mischievously that the Spanish, quote, dames also enjoy a quiet cigar or cigarette. A day's outing was made to the village of Santa Ana, and we can follow her route on Herrera's 1819 map of Manila and its environs. I'll change glasses. So here we have Manila, and they travel along here, across the Balati River, up here, past the cemetery, to Santa Ana. Unlike several earlier authors who painted a glowing picture of the village, a favoured residential area for the wealthy because of its better climate, Anna dismisses the destination with barely a sentence. She says it's a small village 2 miles away. Anna had other interests. She was fascinated by her visit to the cemetery, her fascination perhaps reflecting the popularity of Gothic literature that had taken Britain by storm. She writes that it is, quote, a place of singular construction through which one cannot walk without experiencing a thrill of horror. After a detailed description of the cemetery's architecture and furniture, she describes how uncollected bodies are, quote, taken from their coffin and thrown into a species of Golgotha attached to the cemetery. She passes on to the reader with some relish stories that have been recounted to her. We hear of the gruesome fate of the sailor who wagered that he would spend the night alone in the cemetery, and accounts of the dead walking through, quote, those portions of the cemetery into which the moon's rays could not penetrate. One of the must-see sites for visitors to Manila in the 19th century, and today for that matter, was the Taal volcano. Using Henry Ellis's sketch of the area, which he produced for his 1858 account of the lakes of Luzon, we can plot Anna's route. So the route that they take is down the is overland until they pick up around Santa Ana, the Pasig River, and by boat down towards Laguna de Bayo. Here they take the boat to somewhere around here, which is Binan. Then some days later, they overland through several smaller villages here, Cubayo, Calamba, and then another boat to Los Banos, across to Talam Island. Then later they overland from Calamba through San Tomas, Tanuan, to the Lake of Bombong, or Lake Taal, to where the volcano is. So that's their route that they take. Their route home she never mentions. Anna was captivated by the flora and fauna of the area. By the lake we learn that it was abounded with pretty and sweet-scented flowers and alligators. In the rice fields she describes long-legged birds with beautiful white plumage and waxes lyrically on the gentle and lazy buffaloes enjoying their evening bath. The lake offered Anna her first sight of flying foxes, describing their heavy wings as, quote, as a sort of mackintosh which in wet weather they can completely envelop themselves in. As to the taste, she declares that it tasted like very coarse beef and could not recommend eating it. Setting out from Binan, the family travelled overland to Los Banos at the lake's edge. The lake's edge, passing through the village of Santa Rosa, Caboyo, and Calamba, which in her view were dirty-looking places. Here they take a boat to the foot of the Makiling mountain for a spot of hunting, bagging wild duck, snipe, and pigeon. She admires the lofty green mountain covered with trees and vegetation, which in her opinion stands out impressively against the flat surrounding landscape. This part of the trip gives Anna the opportunity to return to a favourite topic, boats. How they worked, their efficiency and level of comfort, and how they performed in comparison with those in Europe. In view of how much time a distanced traveller in the 19th century spent on boats, and the variety of boats encountered, it is not surprising that it should occupy their thoughts. I refer you back to Professor Ocampo's presentation yesterday, in which he pointed out the variety and number of vessels that appeared on the Valade map. But Anna has a particular interest, and she really does explore these boats much more fully than any other writer that I have come travel writer writing at in the same period of the same area. Of the casco, Anna explains that its cumbrous cask-like appearance belies its speed, but she is struck by the unwieldy rudder, which she says takes 7 men to arrange for sailing. And she really does embark on quite a long description about how the men had to jump in, 7 men had to jump in the water, 2 were on board to manipulate this rudder into position to move it on. And one of those gorgeous fishing boats it describes as looking like an immense dragonfly, the canoe being its narrow body and the net fixed for drying, resembling the 2 wings. Few travellers to the Philippines in the 19th century failed to comment on the pervasiveness of the sport of cockfighting, including Anna, who provides us with her husband's account seen in the village of Tanuan. Their reaction was one of profound disgust. And I must say I was really impressed on some of the maps that we looked at yesterday where the cockfighting sort of images were evident in either vignettes or in the cartouches. So it is clearly something that the Spanish colonists were quick to recognize the possible financial rewards from this indigenous passion. In the early 18th century, legislation was passed to tax and regulate the sport. Licenses to operate cockpits were sold to the highest bidder, those operating without a license could be arrested and fined. Remuneration from this sport sent healthy profits to the colonial coffers. In 1854, the government was able to collect 80,000 silver dollars from the Manila area alone, and another 15 to 20,000 from each of the provinces. So popular was the sport that priests complained that the Feast of Corpus Christi had been allowed to spread over 3 days instead of the normal one, simply to allow competitors more time to travel from pit to pit in pursuit of their, quote, sinful pleasures. Not all was plain sailing for the Dalmadas. Accidents did happen. En route to Lake Bonbon, their carriage overturned and was too damaged to carry them further. Alone without their guide, who had been instructed to stay with the carriage for fear that the Tulisan, the infamous robber gangs, would steal it. They were obliged, bloody noses and sprained ankles, to walk the remaining distance to the lake in search of accommodation at the house of a man called Gonzales. There are no unhappy endings in Anna's book, and any adversity is met with heroic stoicism. She stalwartly asserts that in time of crisis, and they did have a few, quote, "We put our shoulders courageously to the wheel and surmount the obstacles before us," end quote. The following morning, rising at 4 a.m. and breakfasting on a hard-boiled turkey egg, courtesy of Senor Gonzales, they rode out to the volcano. Her effort was well rewarded. She describes in some wonderment the 5-mile crater containing steaming water with small lakes, one bright green and the other streaked rose-coloured orange and green. There have been several eruptions since her visit in 1862. Great changes to the landscape took place to the area after the 1911 eruption, and the lakes of different colours that Anna so enthusiastically described disappeared. Amongst the 19th century visitors to the volcano were several Germans with particular interest in geology. Some of their work you'll see in the exhibition, whose accounts provided information on the conditions of the Tal volcano between major eruptions. Anna too provides a potted history of the volcano's activity, which she declares is her careful translation of the work of a Spanish author. But sadly, she fails to provide the source, so we don't know who this Spanish author is. The trip to the Tal volcano concludes Anna's account of their time in Manila, and also concludes this little presentation. So to conclude, As one of the earliest female tourists to publish her experiences in Manila, Anna's work is an invaluable addition to the literature of travel writing on the Philippines. She observed details that the pedagogical nature of more formal histories and commentaries overlooked. And when considered in the light of the loss the city experienced by the 1863 and consequent earthquakes and the other man-made disasters that followed, Anna's record takes on a poignant significance. Hers is a unique snapshot in which she captured the land and its social, cultural and daily events as she interpreted them in the 4 weeks between March and April 1862. Thank you. Hands, yes. In London. Yes, in London. It's a London publishing house. They also published her husband's book. So.
Would you share with the request to get all these wonderful images?
Well, I have to say, Rolf helped me, but the internet is the most, we have to say, it is the most wonderful way of sourcing originally. I must say, it was hard when you're not somewhere, when you're not at a Spanish library or a Filipino library, it was quite hard sourcing it. So, yeah, so it's been a mixture of bits and pieces. Yes.
We can know if the author is related to the Almeida family of Macau, which is quite a prominent Macau's family.
Yes, very definitely. His uncle they had family in Macau, and while they're on this 6-month tour, they make several trips to Macau of some days. She's very, very modest. They never talk about the family. Her baby is mentioned twice in the 6 months. But she's very discreetly, they're staying with Baron C or visiting Signor P, or we've just had dinner with Colonel L. So nobody is ever disclosed. But the Almeidas were originally Portuguese in Macau. So very, very likely.
Are you going to Bulgaria yourself?
Say that again?
Are you going to Bulgaria yourself?
I've been there.
Good. But it's fortunate that your car did not break down. But if it had done, you could have found Mr. Gonzalez there to look after you. I hear it is very interesting in that, aren't you?
But talking about Senor Gonzalez is also mentioned in Henry Ellis's account, because Henry Ellis, when he does his trips to the lakes, he also is searching out Mr. Gonzalez. So obviously it's, passes down, where do we stay? Oh, we stay with Mr. Gonzalez, who does actually. She describes his dwelling, it was a very rude dwelling, and I must say that they were, as a couple, an amazingly adventurous couple. They did stay in really quite rude, primitive accommodation, but without, there was they were young. She was 26, he was only 21, younger than her, and they're clearly having a grand time.
How much does she talk about Manila society? The church and state?
She talks a lot about the church. She talks about prisons. She talks about the way the colonial government deals with crime. She talks very little about the architecture, which is something that you as a tourist would think about. And she talks about the difference, the various levels of civilization. So people, putting people on the spectrum of where they are on the hierarchy of civilization. Very little. It is surprising. She speaks very, very little about food. A lot about eggs. They eat a lot of eggs. On their travels, they're always being given boiled eggs. She talks about rice manufacturing and the way they grow it, but she never talks about eating it. And this is what I mentioned at the beginning, she flits, she darts from place to place, and it's almost a case of which is the brightest flower I'll settle on. But no, she doesn't talk about, she drinks chocolate. They drink quite a lot of chocolate with their boiled eggs. But no, there's very little talk about their food.
Liliana, that was a wonderful talk. It's talks like that give a context to the maps that we're interested in, and I think we all appreciated that. If my maths is correct, she didn't live very long. Do we know much about what happened to her after and what she died from?
She died in childbirth, I believe, because she died shortly after the birth of her third child. She came from a sort of lower nobility family. Her father they were a military family. She was one of about 6 daughters. We know very little. She got married in 1860 on Henley-on-Thames to this man who was considerably younger than herself. And then I think they go traveling immediately after their marriage, because she gives birth to her first child in Pau, down in the Pyrenees. And I have a suspicion that they may have actually picked up their boat, possibly their P&O boat in Marseille, because you had the mail boat already going from Marseille to Malta and Alexandria. But that I need to really check on.
I know some of you might be going to the vicinity of Lake Taal during this trip, but the island, Lake Taal, in fact, was the caldera of the volcano many, many years ago. And on the east side of Tagaytay, where the lake, where you can see the lake, there's a mountain called Mount Gonzales, which unfortunately Richard is not a relation, otherwise I would have claimed the mountain.
Well, we didn't see this picture when we went, sadly. It obviously had truly changed its appearance by the time we got there. If there are no other questions, how do I... Thank you.
Thank you so much to Liliana. What a great presentation. Our next speaker is the organizer of this event, Mr. Rudolph J.H. Leitz. Rolf, as he is known by many, is a transplant to the Philippines from Germany and has lived here for more than 50 years. Rolf is an astute businessman specializing in imports, supply chain management, and logistics. But as a young man, Rolf was fascinated with maps and geography and began collecting antique prints related to islands. Eventually, his interest shifted to prints and travel-related books of the Philippines. In 1995, Rolf and his intrepid wife, Elizabeth, opened the Gallery of Prints, which I understand many of you went to last night. And the Gallery of Prints remains the only antique print gallery in the Philippines. Rolf is the Philippine representative to IMCOS and one of the founding members of FIMCOS. Rolf is also the author of The Philippines in the 19th Century, a coffee table book featuring more than 200 antique prints of the country. Today, Rolf speaks to us on the Berghaus maps of the Philippines. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Rudolph J.H. Leitz.
Test. Good morning, everybody. Welcome again. And today we talk about the Berghaus maps on the Philippines from the unfinished Atlas of Asia, which was a scientific and artistic achievement that made Justus Perthes, a world-renowned publishing house, but financially was a total disaster. Can we have the images, please? There we go. The last IMCOS-Symposium was hosted in Hamburg, Germany in 2017, last year. And in her guest editorial on German cartography in the subsequent IMCOS 2017 Winter Journal, Petra Swatek mentioned the eminent publishing houses of Perthes, Stieler et al. Thus, to span the bridge from Germany to the Philippines, and as a German who has lived here for half a century, I cannot let this opportunity pass to at least talk about the influence that German cartography has had with respect to the Philippines and their contribution. The extremely rare and large-size maps of Berghaus, prized targets for any collector of Philippine maps. Not only do Germany and the Philippines share some common historic interests, what with José Rizal, the national hero, who studied in Heidelberg, went to Berlin, visited Virchow, interacted with his bosom friend Ferdinand Blumentritt, who is claimed by 3 countries because he was ethnic German from the Sudeten, part of the Austro-Habsburg Empire at that time, was a glowing admirer of Franz Josef. And today, Bohemia is part of the Czech Republic, so we have the Czech ambassador, the German ambassador, and the Austrian ambassador all fighting for Ferdinand Blumentritt. So, but even going back further, 1523, only 2 years after Magellan, Jakob Schöner, in a globe that was long lost and was found, I think, about 80 years ago, presents the first mentioning of a Philippine island in printed material, namely a globe, not on a map, but a globe. This was apparently based on the Transylvanus account of the Magellan Elcano trip, the Moluccas Insulis, which was published the same year earlier in Cologne, a very small book. I've had it in my hands. It was sold to an institution, I think in Australia, not so long ago. And so every German generation following the prolific German cartography of the 16th century was challenged to follow in their footsteps, at times failing for reason of political circumstances, religious circumstances, but generally succeeding well into the 19th century. And that's where we will start now, namely the Berghaus maps on the Philippines. And this is the overview of my presentation. And we have the protagonists, and that is Dr. Heinrich Carl Wilhelm Berghaus, who was a professor of applied mathematics at the Bauakademie in Berlin, specialized in cartography before he moved to Gotha. Important, it's not Gotha or Gotham, that's somewhere else. Okay, a small town then of 12,000 people then in today's Thuringia province. The area is about 300 kilometers south of Berlin, just to put you into the geographic picture. So from that incredible Prussian capital of that time, he was moved or needed to move to the duchy of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, and which was a center of the natural sciences in Germany at that time, today still visible through the Natural Sciences Museum and the planetarium. But on the other, a German dynasty linked to the kings of Belgium, of Portugal, Bulgaria, and most importantly the UK. They were renamed, because a very long German name, the Windsors, by King George V. So Wilhelm Perthes, the son of Justus Perthes, who was the founder of the publishing house, that was his partner in crime, I was about to say, partner in this venture. Since 1828, Berghaus had plans out of a cartographic undertaking of gigantic proportions. So he aimed at, and that's what he wrote in his letters to Adolf Stieler, to counterbalance the movement in England. They were fascinated always with England, Industrial Revolution, and so forth to come. The liberal bourgeoisie movement that began to drive the Industrial Revolution. Century-old trade restrictions were considered being lifted. The British Act of Navigation lasted this long, finally abandoned in 1849, so after more than 200 years. And the East India Company lost its privileges in 1833, so just at about that time. So Berghaus had worked, and then he abandoned the project of the Aerosmith map. And please bear with me that the text is in the center and some of the images are on the left and right, otherwise we don't do the time allotted to me. So this is the enormous Aerosmith Map of Asia. And he said what the English can do, the Germans can do anytime. That was his, cousins sort of have competition with each other. So, and he abandoned it, but simultaneously he worked on the map of the Philippines. I've researched and researched to try and find out what fascinated him on the Philippines, judging for myself why I am here. But he didn't meet any young lady from the Philippines then, so I really don't know what his fascination was, why he started with the Philippines. Maybe he anticipated Jose Rizal and Ferdinand Blumentritt, that I have never been able to find out. So he needed to find a financial partner, and he contacted Simon Schropp. Image please. And some of us who were in Berlin after the symposium last year visited the Simon Schropp shop, which exists until this very day. It is the longest surviving cartography shop, a map shop from that period. Just imagine, they celebrated their 275th year. So that in itself was an event that I did not forget and comes in very handily with our famous Heinrich Berghaus. So, but Schropp had some personal problems. He said, I cannot attend to that. And he said, very prophetically, that takes so much money. I don't want to venture that. I don't think you're going to succeed. So, his problems also were in getting the privilege, getting registered. So finally, in 1742, he got the royal appointment that he was seeking. And Berghaus needed to approach somewhere else, and he approached Wilhelm Perthes, and they signed the 50-50 joint venture. And thus born was the title of the Großer Atlas, der außereuropäischen Erdteile in Großadler-Format, die erste Abteilung Asia. May I have the picture, please? There we go. All right? And the translation you will see there. So since he did not, and this is one of the idiosyncrasies here, he did not own maps. He did not have first-hand knowledge. He never traveled to Asia. So this is like Karl May, for those German-speaking ones, who wrote about the Wild West and the Americas, had never been there, but knew everything from the last cactus in the desert and how to circumvent it. However, he relied on an immense library of his. He relied on borrowings especially of scientific tractations that were unpublished. And he had many friends, natural scientists, foremost of whom was Alexander von Humboldt. Royal houses, ministries, the diaries of the Prussian Navy, the English naval captains like James Hosberg, the hydrographer of the East India Company in London, who handed Backhaus a complete volume of all the naval charts that he had collected. The Russian admiral of German descent, von Krusenstern, publisher of the Atlas on the Pacific Ocean, the Dutch Bureau of Longitudes, and not to forget, this shows von Humboldt, by the way, in his studies, and with a beautiful map of the world in the background. And not to forget Lieutenant Ildefonso de Aragon, Chief of the Royal Corps of Engineers in Manila. So new findings would prompt him to make corrections instead of keeping such information. So he fell victim to trying to do too much, too soon, too fast, and all together. He did not want to do one at a time. So he collected and collected and collected and collected. No, this is not good enough. I have to improve on this one. No, that's not good enough. So by the time he finally said, okay, it's time, well, time passes. Time is always your enemy. So he wanted 15 maps of Asia in the beginning to be published at 5 per year. Can you have the next one, please? Since 1831. So then he expanded that to 19 till 1834. And then he wanted 10 maps for an African atlas. And if successful, another Atlas of America. And he wrote that, in that case, we might as well also do Australia so we get the continents going. But the first map then was only published in 1833, so 2 years had already passed, with a publication date of December 32. So the 3 years therefore grew into 5. And each map, and this is the key of his scientific prowess, as he claimed of himself, each one was to be accompanied by a dissertation, the famous Denkschriften, the memoirs, wherein he would present the geographic stand of knowledge, how this information resulted in the cartographic execution of the map, very ethnographic details, geological data. He explains why this mountain was excluded or included, was dubious or needed to be moved by a degree fraction, every coastline, every port, every island, every detail. So the annotations and changes until the final product was a tremendous process that moved up and consumed all his time. So these memoirs, for the first 4 maps that he published, were intended at 1,500 copies in quarto size. And later, as time was running away, he became anxious because of these slow sales, and this is where it all begins. Such voluminous scientific abstracts. So in the end, only 8 memoirs of 8 maps in 9 parts were published, 7 maps without. And this is what the title of the publications looks like. All right? And here we see the first delivery. And the collection of these Denkschriften, of these memoirs, of all of them, is a collector's dream because you cannot find them. I had one that burnt in the fire I had in 2005. At that time, it cost 5,000, in today's money, 5,000 euro. Just the memoirs alone. So once in a while you can find an individual one, like I have one of this one that shows the, where are we? Inter-Indian, so that's India, the Persian Gulf, and then the number 13 being the Philippines. So this is, of course, the one important for us here. But just to find that one, in my 40 years, I have found one. That's how rare. So it's even rarer, if you like, than the maps that we are talking about, which are equally rare. Here, this is what they look like. Can we show a few more? So this is the individual one of the Philippines and the Zulu Islands. So let us start with the number 13. I was born on the 13th, so 13 is not a number that I'm scared of. And the Philippines is the number 13. The most well-known of the Philippine-related maps. It's also in the exhibition, and you can see for yourself when you stand in front of it, which the projection can barely show, how extremely detailed and sensationally done this map is. It is but only one of the three that are related to the Philippines and our Philippine interest to collectors of the Philippines and Southeast Asia. The total number of this one printed is only 623. So therefore, it makes it one of the rarest 19th century maps on the Philippines. The number of memoirs I mentioned, 1,500, and the engraving process took 1.5 years. Who provided the information? Primarily Malaspina and Espinosa. Aragon, we mentioned earlier. And Aragon also wrote a dedication on one of the first printed maps that he was able to send to Manila. So here we go. This is the map of Aragon that we are showing on the wall in the exhibition. Also, the entire book with all the maps is in one of the vitrines that you can look at. An extremely rare book that Aragon has produced with tables of data and more data, population. It's a complete history of the Philippines, like a bibliography, a tremendous book. In my 50 years again, I found one, and that's the one you see there. I've never been able to find a second one for sale. So here we see the inset on the upper right, and that is the Bay of Manila. And we see additional, can we move the insets please? We see the inset number 2, which is the Islas Batanes. Batanes are the Bashi Islands in many of the older maps. These are the northernmost islands of the Philippines, the stormy islands, the windy islands, as we call them. They connect to Taiwan, Formosa, to the north. All the typhoons, the earlier ones particularly, pass through there. So you can visit as a tourist. You have only a window of like 3 to 4 months. All the rest, chances that you cannot leave or cannot land are very high. And the vessel, you need to have some naval background to be able not to become seasick. But they are wonderful, tremendous islands, very beautiful and very special. And the climate is also very special as a result. So you have the Batanes Islands, then you have the Mindoro Channel, and here you have the picture again of Taal Lake. You have the, not yet please, don't preempt my punchline. Thank you. And Mindoro Island is here, in between beautiful areas of scuba diving, corals, etc. The upper reef is there in between. But he inserted, if you remember the map before, he inserted that inset in an area that houses the Scarborough Shoal. And of course he knew about the dispute that we have with China at that time already, and therefore he decided to spare it out so that you can see it. And that's why I blew it up, to show you how detailed at that time, more detailed than Horsburgh, which we will see later, he depicted that Bajo de Scarborough, or Masingola Maruna, another name that you don't see everywhere. Okay, so can we get the zoom back? There we are, you see, and that is where Scarborough Shoals is. Can we, on this one, sorry for those that can see this one better. up there. That's where the location is, and that's where he spared it out as a small V-cut, a lady's V-cut, so that one can see Scarborough. The inset number 4, where are we? These are the southern parts of the Philippines, which would be down here, bordering to Borneo. The famous Sabah case of Philippines and Malaysia, not fighting anymore, but disagreeing on who owns Sabah as a sultanate. So he shows this one as an inset, then he shows the next inset, which is, where do we have it? There we go. The southern part, also down here, because the upper one was Palawan going south. This one is Zulu Islands, Tawi-Tawi, down there. Beautiful place, beautiful islands, wonderful scenery, but this is the part that most Westerners read about in the newspapers when they talk about Muslim, ISIS, etc., decapitation, hostages, and so forth. And that is farther away than Hong Kong is from Manila, from here. Then we have the inset number 6, which is the Bongo Bay. Bongo, again, appears in many travelogues of travelers, the French, the Brits, because, why? It was, the mountain is the holy mountain of the Muslims, Bongao Mountain, near the, which is called here the Pollock Bay. I've only seen pictures, I've not personally been there, but a beautiful area, a tremendous place. So, during my 25 years of actively buying and selling in the gallery, I have only owned 3 of the Philippine map. One that was damaged, one that was a printer's copy, actually, and I've sold, and one that you see here, and I've sold 4 more. So, I know of about 6 more in private hands here in the Philippines, so that gives a total of about 13. And then I found, I think, about a dozen or 14 or so all over the world when I researched. So maybe 25 to 30 pieces exist in the world. And let's say even if there's 100, still it would make it a tremendously rare and very rare piece for any collector. So, 2 years passed, and number 14, the South China Sea, no memoir, together with the number 9, the Assam description, China Coast number 16, all right, here we go, and you see the incredible detail on each particular map. And this is the trade of Backhouse, who wanted to do better than the English. So this was a, you could call it a nationalistic, a patriotic type of competition, but they were friends, very good friends with James Horsburgh, so it was more the neighbors competing with each other. A year after, the third tranche, the Dirteli from 1835, Syria, 48-page memoir only, so the number of pages diminished as the interest in the memoirs diminished, as the costs accumulated, and when he realized, nobody is interested in what we are doing. So, and here we find precisely the number 14. Not very well known amongst Philippine collectors. The total number printed and published, 434. And that's the map with the smallest number produced amongst all the 15 of the finished items. There are, where are we? This is the blow up. Not so quick, please. Can we go back, please? So this is the number 14 from before. This is the part of the Philippines. This is northern Borneo. All right. This is this one. Okay. This is what you see here. Third delivery. Can we? Syria was the number 5. Next. So, equally important to the West Philippine Sea analysis or the China Sea analysis that has been talked about yesterday on various occasions, but it shows also a few other interesting places, namely the Royal Captain's Shoal with the year 1773. Can we move that, please? There we go. Okay, and that is up here, upper right, comparing the Horsburgh with the Backhouse map. There we go, up there we have it, here. And when you compare, there. Why do I show this? Because there was a shipwreck that was discovered with enormous treasures 20 years ago, now displayed in the National Museum of the Philippines. And that is why, if you compare the two, you see that Horsburgh doesn't have as many details yet as Backhouse had. Backhouse improved on the Horsburgh. We said, I know more, I gathered more details. Here you are, Mr. James. Then after another year, the 4th trench, South Asia, Himalaya, and a remark that the memoirs would come in the next installment because I'm not yet ready with them. North China Sea, the number 15. And this is the next one of interest. No memoir. Total number published, 510. So everything around 500 pieces only, so very little. Here we are. This is the map. Philippines, the entire eastern side of the Philippines with multiple insets. This is the area of the bone of contention, is Scarborough, all the major shoals and reefs you have in here. And Taiwan, and you have this part, namely Hong Kong, Lantau, Macau. All right. Can we see the blow up again? And this is just one of the island chains. I just wanted to show the extreme detail that he was capable of producing. Insets, Camiguin, St. Vincent's Port, Subic Bay, the former military base, Capones Point, Silangin Harbor. So, on one hand, I was fortunate enough. There we go. Also in the exhibit. You see, this is a printer's proof. Backhouse employed multiple persons to create one map. Not only one engraver for the topography, and another engraver for the text, another engraver for the special writings that he needed, usually 4 or 5 that were part of it, and therefore multiple running of one sheet of paper over various plates. And there you go. This is from the plate where the cartouche is not yet there, the profiles are not yet there, and some of the insets. So I was able to save that. Here we go. There you see. Not yet there. All of this is not yet there. So a wonderful printer's proof, a collector's dream when you find it. And fortunate enough to have salvaged it from the fire, and that is why it has the indenture on the right side. You still see the burn marks. And on the rear, on the back, and I don't look at the back anymore, it's framed, it stays there. I don't dare touch it because I'm afraid it will disintegrate. And I have not wanted to restore it out of sentimentality, if you like. It says there it is plate 14, when in reality it is the 15. And there's a manuscript annotation in pencil at the rear that says, Doublette Nummer so und so, aber noch nicht fertig. Not yet finished. And then in 1837, the last installment of 15 maps, to complete that figure, the number 11 Sumatra, the 17 the Zulu Islands, the 19 the Ural. Why the Ural? Not part of the Atlas in the first place. And the number 2 China and Japan. And this number 17, the Sunda, is not very well known to most collectors of Southeast Asia and Indonesia, because it was then the largest individual map of that particular area to come out during that period in time, and dedicated to von Krusenstern with various insets. Can we see the insets, please? Batavia, Jakarta, Gaspar Straits, Sunda Straits, Lombok, tourism center of Borneo, Alas Straits, Sapi Straits. That's a grandiose format and scale that he was after. This is the blow-up of the cartouche. His credo, therefore, as I am trying to show, was perfection is my work. But he overlooked that one decisive factor. It is one thing to create something, but if you have a cost that is commercially not viable, it will not sell. You learn that in hindsight when it is often too late. So, Berlin, as the Prussian capital, had the best engravers, but obviously also the most expensive. So, for 2,000 thaler for one copper plate, that would have meant in today's purchasing power something like 70,000 euro just for that alone. When he was looking for a quarter of that, his overall cost of the map went into tremendous fears. So he ended up paying 687 thaler for the master engraver Selma Siebert. That's the S point period Siebert that you see as the engraver. That was Selma. And every single engraver that he worked with, he ended up fighting with. So that's why for every map he had another master engraver. So until he ran out of the engravers. And my theory is that it's not only that one, but also the fact that he couldn't find an engraving house willing to work with him anymore, because he wanted too much at that time from each of them. And then they were even accused of not doing it themselves, but only their assistants. So he said, I'm being charged for your assistant, so you have to give me a 50% discount. So this is like here Tawad. So what did Selma Siebert do? He emigrated to the US, the center of all German immigration. And since 1841, he worked as the chief engraver to the coastal mapping out of Washington, D.C. So he could not have been a bad engraver, I'm very sure. So each map had outline, I mentioned earlier, lettering and topography, engraving styles. Each process for each map took something like 2 years. The Philippines, as I mentioned earlier, 1.5 years. So much so that the Ural, he did lithographically to catch up with only 6 months, but didn't make it to the Atlas of Asia. So his average cost, $1,000 per plate. Loss already at that time, 2,300. Until 1837, 9,500. Today's money around 330,000 euros. So you're talking about $380,000 in time. So an unbelievable amount of money lost. And he couldn't sell. So even von Humboldt intervened. He went to royalty. He went begging, literally, on behalf of his friend Wilhelm Berghaus. But, as often is the case, you don't get money, you only get honors, only quote unquote. So Friedrich Wilhelm III awarded him with a large gold medal for art and science, and Patis with a smaller one, but no money. Then a slap in the face on top of that. One of the officers of the Princess Louise, one of the famous Prussian warships then, they went on a world trip and brought with them not Berghaus maps, but Aerosmith maps. And said that, well, we could have sold all of them had we only brought more. Not only in America, but especially in Manila, we could have sold them all. So they also came to Manila. And then they approached the universities, they approached the schools, and they gave samples. And the schools said, oh, thank you very much, but never returned the samples. I also find that in our business with pharmaceutical raw materials, import and food ingredients, you give the samples, you never get them back for comparative purposes if something goes right or wrong. So, after those 5 deliveries, of which the 4 first ones contained most of the unpublished reports, production stopped, the budget was exceeded, subscriptions were much lower, and after 20 years of selling, $5,000 a deficit, shared as per the joint venture 50-50 supposedly, but in 1853, the Patis House decided, you are our friend, we'll write it off, tax deductible. So, and this one shows the list of the 15 maps, the items I have put together with the Philippine concerning maps in bold. Here we go. And the important column is the total cost per sheet, that is this column. Here we go. The total number of maps that were published, and the total number of memoirs that were published. Okay, so it's for those who can only see this part. So here we go. Total number of maps, total number of memoirs. So that means anything from that atlas, in principle, is very rare. It depends, do the areas have a collector interested in it? So Ural is the cheapest, if you find it. Apparently there are not so many map collectors in the Ural. Indonesia is relatively inexpensive because also strangely, Indonesia does not have that many map connoisseurs aficionados. So, but those countries that do have, and that would be Hong Kong, remember, this was 1834, so well before Nori and others depicting Hong Kong. So that's a prized map for any collector of Hong Kong or Macau or China, for that matter. And of course the Philippines, because here people are very aware of the few materials that exist on the Philippines, and especially on very large maps. So a tremendous collection to have. So what did Berghaus say in 1837? I've lost my entire working capital in this venture. I made a bad investment. So he realized that. But we gained the greatest respect abroad regarding the quality of our work. And Bernhard Perthes, who was the heir to the Wilhelm Perthes, on their centennial stated in 1885 that despite the fact that our company financially suffered a great deal as a result of this ill-fated undertaking, the indirect advantage gained cannot be expressed in monetary terms. We became a publishing house of world repute. And if you think that the story ends here, you are mistaken, because there is a phoenix that rises from the ashes. Because remember the rivalry with the British? So, no, we made a mistake, we did something wrong, but we can do better. So, both partnered again, and they created the Physikalische Atlas, which became one of the greatest success stories of German atlas production, gathering the most minute details on geology, hydrography, meteorology, Earth's magnetism, ethnography, geographical distribution of the plant and the animal realms. And here, this is the title page in the 3rd edition. And that atlas was intended to illustrate Cosmos, the masterwork of Alexander von Humboldt. One of the plates from that masterpiece of the Physikalische Atlas, a tremendously detailed, unbelievable plate. And it was Humboldt who edged them on all this time. And that's why he's my paragon of accomplishment, that if you keep on hammering on something and edge and continue, as long as you have it on your mind, you can do it. And this is what happened, and they succeeded. So, the best atlas financially. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It was a pleasure. Yes.
Are there any questions for Rolf? Oh, here we go. Yes?
Rolf, that was outstanding.
Thank you.
That was outstanding, Rolf, and a great contribution, a lot of work. Perthes seemed to be a junction point between Berghaus on one hand and, I've got a middle block, the other great German...
Stieler.
What's his name? Yeah. No, not Stieler. Petermann.
Okay.
And Petermann continued with Goethals for quite some time and had a slightly different sort of approach. He worked much more, I think, interacting with British contributions. Did Berghaus and Petermann know each other? Was Petermann a student of Berghaus? Was there a relationship between the two?
No, I think this evolved because Petermann had a different idea. I think he learned from the very esoteric approach of Heinrich Berghaus, and they decided to publish travelogues, make it interesting for a larger type of audience, and then added maps, very, very detailed, sensational, beautiful maps to collect, also of the Philippines that we have here in the exhibition, to make that interesting. So from that point of view, yes, they knew each other, not personally, but they knew the descendants, yes, and therefore decided to have a different approach to make it commercially viable. And the Petermann series went well into the 20th century when Germany, after the Second World War, got split up. They were located in the then communist eastern part, in the Soviet zone, as it was originally called, and published still until, I think, 1989, just before the changeover. Yeah? So, in fact, one of my references is a 1960 edition of the Petermann. Agustin.
Taking in relationship with engraving, I assume was not copper, was iron engraving.
This is, thank you for bringing this up, Agustin. This is the resurrection of copper engraving in Germany. Every single one, except for the lithographic plate, was a copper engraving. Because Heinrich Backhaus felt that any other engraving would not do justice to the fineness of detail that he was after. So you have to imagine, you are in the 1830s, lithography was invented by Alois Senefelder 1792, I think. So that was already 40 years into lithography. So why choose copper engraving? There's steel engraving that was very rampant by that time. No, copper engraving, because of that detail.
Yes, thank you.
And sorry, go ahead.
Yes, another question. I assume all this information regarding this atlas was incorporated also to the Stieler Atlas of the 50s, 60s?
No. Of course, they had their own copyrights, if you like. So he also had worked for Stieler and did plates for Stieler. But some were published in Stieler, that is correct. I think 3 or 4 plates were, but Stieler's size was considerably smaller. So they wouldn't fit, that kind of size wouldn't fit into a Stieler atlas. Peter.
Rolf, you mentioned that it's just as hard or even harder to find the memoirs than it is to find the maps. And yet for the Philippines, it's 623 maps and 1,500 memoirs. So aren't there extra copies of the memoirs floating around out there?
Yeah. Memoirs were not considered something to keep. They were more like a scientific tractation. So who wants to keep a scientific tractation except maybe a university? So those...
I do.
Who said I do? Who? Okay, so congratulations.
Hope it takes you enough time to read it. So the moral is, if you would like a map of Berghaus on the Urals, please let Rolf know and he'll find one for you. Thank you, Rolf. Well, more reasonable than Philippines. Thank you, Rolf. With that, let's take a short break. There's coffee in the back and there are rhubarb tarts in preparation for Richard's next presentation. So please, we'll take a short break. Thank you. To acknowledge our other sponsors, the Aboitiz Foundation, Union Bank, Alson's Insurance, Mafre Insular, our official media partner ANC, the ABS-CBN News Channel, Cinechrome Studios, Now Corporation, Commune, and Juan Brew. We will begin in about 2 minutes. Thank you. I'd also like everyone to take notice of what is the announcement up on the screen. There's a slight change to when we are going to be departing for our afternoon excursion. Instead of meeting at the Diamond Hotel, we are going to meet here in front of the Ayala Museum 45 minutes after the last speaker. So the time is a little bit more flexible. After the last speaker and the last lecture, 45 minutes later, we will meet here in front of the Ayala Museum for the buses to take us to the University of Santo Tomas Library. Also, please note, for those bringing your own cars, there are only 5 parking slots available for you at UST, so it's preferable if you join the buses. Otherwise, please approach the organizer's table to reserve a parking slot if you want to park your car there. Otherwise, you will be on Dapitan Road with everybody else and all the other students. Just a warning. Yes. has made a point. Please disregard the time on your program for the departure and location and the time you have for lunch. It is 45 minutes from the last speaker. So rather than 25 minutes as it is on the program. And so we go on to our next speaker, Dr. Richard T. Jackson. Richard is an industry fellow at the University of Queensland in Australia. He is a professor of geography and has taught in Oxford University, his alma mater, in Makerere University in Uganda, the University of Papua New Guinea, and the James Cook University in Australia. Richard is currently a full-time consultant for the mining industry with projects mainly in Laos and Papua New Guinea. Richard has been a member of IMCOS since 2012 and collects maps of New Guinea and Central Asia. As a young man, Richard worked part-time in the rhubarb forcing industry, which sparked his interest in the history and use of rhubarb. To help us make a connection between rhubarb and martini, I am honored to present Dr. Richard Jackson.
Thank you very much. Yesterday, Beth said that he decided eventually to apply to join FIMCOS, but it had taken him some time because he thought it was a very esoteric organization. My word, Ambeth, when I joined it, there must have been extremely short of members, but anyway, when I joined it, I thought the word to use was intimidating. Academically and intellectually intimidating, frightening. I had worked in universities for 31 years and I had never come across a group of individuals who knew so much about what I considered to be my subject as a professor of geography. And they knew an awful lot more than I did. So when, having squirmed about and avoided having to give a talk to this distinguished group of people for 3 years, when I was eventually nailed to the floor and told I had to give a talk, I thought, what can I talk about which I actually know slightly more, I hope, than they do on. And it's certainly not anything to do with the Philippines, and it's probably nothing to do with maps as such. That would be rhubarb, because unless Professor Clifford Faust of the University of Princeton is still alive, I think I'm in the top 100 people who know about the history of rhubarb in the world. And then I discovered that actually I could do a talk on it. Because there is an interesting period of 100 years in which every European map of Central Asia and China has the word on it somewhere, rhubarb. Now, that will be a surprise to you. When I go to map shops in London and various parts of the world and ask, have you got anything on rhubarb, they talk to each other. No. Sorry, sir, sorry. But it's a fact. It's a fact. Now, in order to introduce this, I have to give quite a lot of background to you. Rhubarb is a plant native to Central Asia. It has spread all around the world now. Virtually every continent, including Antarctica and Greenland, grow rhubarb, believe it or not. The only places where it really doesn't grow are the wet tropics. It can grow in the dry tropics. Israelis have discovered it growing in the Negev desert. It was as a self-irrigating plant. But it doesn't grow well in the warm tropics. It requires cool periods. In order to explain its importance on maps, I've got to give you a little bit more background. This is a famous Chinese hero, Commissioner Lin, who is commemorated across China in statues. Commissioner Lin is famous amongst the British, anyway, for having written a letter to Queen Victoria asking her to stop the British traders selling opium to China. He pointed out, as it turns out wrongly, that opium was not widely used in Britain, whereas in fact it was extremely widely used in Britain.
agricultural labourers in particular were known to be opium addicts through laudanum. And he appealed to the Queen not to allow her merchants to come and sell opium in China. But when that didn't work, and Queen Victoria, I believe, never actually saw this letter, when that didn't work, he advised his emperor that if we stop selling rhubarb and tea to the barbarians, they will be unable to fight. That was his advice. Now, that sounds amazing, but in fact, it has a certain logic to it. Moreover, it has a number of precedents. The logic is that whereas the Mongolians in particular and the northern Chinese to some extent used rhubarb as a horse medicine, in Mongolian its name is Moningishuye, which means horse comrade. And by the way, I shudder to think what a debate in the Mongolian parliament used to be like under communist days, because they would be literally shouting rhubarb at each other. However, they used it as a horse medicine, and they could not understand why the merchants came from all across Asia to buy rhubarb to sell to the Europeans. They imagined, therefore, that Europeans without rhubarb would lose their strength. What's more, the precedents were very important precedents indeed. We may laugh at Commissioner Lin's apparent naivety in thinking that the Chinese could beat the British if they cut off their supplies of rhubarb and tea. But in fact, Napoleon, under the continental system, banned the export of European rhubarb and Russian rhubarb to Britain. It was banned. And if you don't believe me, read Bourrienne's biography of Napoleon. Bourrienne himself was the trade commissioner enforcing the rules of the continental system in Hamburg for several years, and he mocks his emperor for that man's insistence that the British shall get no rhubarb. This is weird. I think you'll all agree this is weird. But even weirder, the British Prime Minister, Spencer Perceval, who was later to be assassinated, and by the way was a distant ancestor of Princess Diana, I beg your pardon. Stop laughing, Elizabeth. He instituted retaliatory measures. No British rhubarb was to be sold from the Weser to the Garonne. A war of mutual constipation was declared. So if Napoleon could do it, why couldn't Commissioner Lin? And that's not all. Henry VIII's leading spy under Cromwell was a man called Andrew Boord, and he was sent to spy on the Emperor Charles V when he invaded North Africa. What was his prize that he brought back from North Africa? Seeds of rhubarb, which he presented to King Henry VIII as a great treasure. And just in case you think this is all to do with the British in some way, what did Columbus say when he got to, when he wrote his first letter back to Queen Isabella? What did Pigafetta report when he got back to Madrid? And what did Da Gama report of what he found in Aceh province? Da Gama thought he found Christian princes and rhubarb in Aceh. Well, we know he was wrong on the first, and I think he might have been right on the second. But every one of the great Iberian explorations has sections on rhubarb. This seems extremely weird to the modern reader. Why would anybody want something that you've just eaten? Why would these great people want it? The Crusader Jean de Jonville, in his history of the life, his biography of King Francis I of France, took time off in Egypt to inquire where rhubarb came from and discovered, wrongly,
that it came from trees in Ethiopia, fell into the River Nile, and it was fished out of the Nile by Egyptian fishermen and then sold to the Europeans. It was wrong, but it was interesting. And the thing is, why? And it wasn't just Europeans either. When Genghis Khan invaded Western Jura in 1226, his chief advisor, Yelu Chutsai, what did he take as loot and booty? Not maps like the British did from Manila. He took rhubarb. All the other troops were going around stealing horses, gold, but he went for the rhubarb. Now, why is this? Okay. Before I do that, there are two more bizarre examples I can give you. Now, these are really bizarre. These I've given you so far, they're all documented. These are not documented. I put them to you. It seems to me there is a strong case, A, of rhubarb's implication in the Black Death. Why? My partner and I, Angie, spent one of the best holidays of our life 2 years ago in Mongolia. And here outside Ulaanbaatar, about 50 kilometers away from there, at an abandoned Soviet missile detection base, we have these cuddly little creatures, which are called marmots, who build mounds, and in building the mounds they throw up stones, and in throwing up the stones they ensure that plants other than grass can get a hold in the otherwise flat plains of Mongolia. And which plant gets the biggest grip? Rhubarb. All these plants on here are rhubarb plants, every one of them. And these animals have their burrows beneath them. The rhubarb hosts these cuddly animals, which actually are the host to the flea which carries the Yersinia pestis bacteria which causes the Black Death. Wherever you find rhubarb in northern China and Mongolia and in Tibet to this day, wherever you find rhubarb there are marmots nearby, which means the Black Death is nearby. Husbands, do not do what I did with Angie and say, come with me, we'll try and find marmots in Mongolia. I think she was a very brave person to accompany me. Sorry. Actually, forget about that, but down here, I couldn't enlarge it. There's one of these cuddly creatures actually nibbling a rhubarb plant. Okay, that's the first bizarre example. Now I think that is correct, actually. But the historians, and there's hundreds of historians around the world who specialize in the Black Death, won't have a bar of this theory from me, but I think it's correct. The second one is even more bizarre, and I'm not going to go into it, I'll leave it for question time. I think that one of the first Christmas presents given to the baby Christ was rhubarb, not myrrh. And the reason I say that is simple. If the wise men who came from the East were Zoroastrian priests, magi, which almost everybody thinks they were, then rhubarb was the perfect gift to the newborn child. Why? Because rhubarb to the Zoroastrians is the symbol of the resurrection of life. It was what God's only son, their God's only son, Gaiamad, when he died, his seed fell upon the earth, and out of that point at the ground sprang a plant which was rhubarb, out of which stepped the first new man and the new woman. It is an appropriate symbol of life after death because rhubarb is the first plant to emerge after the Central Asian winters. So it is botanically sensible. To the Zoroastrian, it made liturgical and symbolic sense. And then if you think about the word myrrh, well, how is it spelt? What has it got in common with rhubarb? Quite a lot. Anyway, you're here to hear about maps, so better get a lot of maps. The person who cleared everything up temporarily about rhubarb and its whereabouts was Marco Polo. It is often said of Marco Polo that it's odd that he doesn't mention tea. What's really odd to me is that he mentions rhubarb. Why is that odd to me? Because he was a merchant, remember. He's not a traveller, he's a merchant. He's not a missionary. His money is in his trade secrets. At the time he went to visit China, rhubarb was already in enormous demand as a medicine, not as a fruit pie. And that's why all these examples I've given you involved vast quantities of rhubarb and money. Marco Polo told everybody where you could find this valuable item, which was a rather strange thing to do for a merchant, it seems to me. Unfortunately, Marco Polo did not provide a map, nor did he, even worse, provide a drawing of what the plant looked like. It's probable, by the way, he never actually saw it growing, but only saw it in the marketplaces. So the Europeans knew where it could be got, but hadn't a really good idea of exactly where that was, or what the plant from which it was derived looked like. It's the root of the rhubarb that was used as the medicine. And a rhubarb root looks like any other sort of root, basically. So the problem was, from what plant did this arrive? Various attempts were made to draw it. This is Mattioli's drawing of rhubarb, which looks nothing like rhubarb whatsoever. But this drawing of rhubarb circulated widely across Europe and lasted for at least 200 years after Mattioli drew it. And some commentators, such as TV, had a sort of triffid-like rhubarb growing, which required 6 men with heavily armed men to control it and harvest it. So people had no idea what the rhubarb plant looked like, and amazingly, they still didn't know what it looked like, even at the end of the 18th century. Only one European, to my knowledge, had seen rhubarb growing in the wild. Sorry, 2 Europeans had seen rhubarb growing in the wild and could identify it as such. One was a Scotsman called John Bell. The other was our hero today, Martini, who had seen it growing in China, and when he went to the Netherlands, to Leiden, saw it growing in Mr. Nobelaar's garden, and said, that is the rhubarb, that is where you get all the medicine from. Which is why Father Kirke has an engraving of rhubarb, the first accurate medicinal rhubarb engraving ever seen in Europe. John Gerard, the English physician, had a picture of the edible rhubarb that you've just eaten a little before that, but the first medicinal rhubarb plant accurately shown was that of Kirke in 1660 something. Okay, as for the maps, okay, now I know Munster's a lot of people's favourite cartographer, but he's not mine, and I don't think he's any traveller's favourite cartographer, because his maps are, they're not a very good guide to get to places. Because, as you will see there, he has rhubarb growing on the shores of the Arctic Sea. Tangut is Western Jia, which is basically Gansu province of modern China. So that's Munster's guess as to where you could find rhubarb. The surprising thing is that only 20 or 30 years later we had the wonderful... if I was a rich man, this is the first expensive map I would buy, would be Gastaldi's. Only 20 or 30 years later, this wonderful map of China, where we have... Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. Where we have, here in this circle, Sucre, which is Marco Polo's Suchao in Gansu province, presently called Jiaquan. It's one of the major towns in Gansu province. Suchao, from which comes the true rhubarb. 1560, one or two or thereabouts. For 100 years after Gastoldi produced his map, every significant European map of Central Asia had something like that. So, Gortelius, 1750, from these mountains comes rhubarb. Dehode, various dates. Suchao, which gives birth to which provides the true rhubarb. Spies, 1626, out of this kingdom one will have all the rhubarb to be brought them to Europe. And there are many, many, many more. I'll come to that in a moment. Now, as time went on, a certain degree of confusion began to rise in European minds. Polo's information seems to me to have been largely forgotten by most Europeans. It is understandable why this was so, in my opinion, for several reasons. Firstly, the Silk Road, the so-called Silk Road, had been closed down for centuries. Once the Ottoman Empire started to control its end of the Silk Road, it wouldn't let foreigners along it. I don't know why the Silk Road, or as it's the inventor of the term, Richthofen, called it the Silk Roads, Strassen, not Strasse, the Silk Roads, which is actually fairly accurate. When he invented that term, the Silk Road had not been in use for centuries. What had been in use was the rhubarb route. Because rhubarb continued to move westwards when silk went by sea, as was said yesterday by some person. The Silk Road is a misnomer of the greatest consequence, but I suppose if the Chinese went around saying their new Belt and Road policy is based on the old rhubarb route, they wouldn't get quite as much mileage politically. Secondly, the Russians had moved into Siberia, and most of the rhubarb trade now went through Russia and was the personal monopoly of the Tsars of Russia. It was worth, in modern times, it was worth $1.5 million US a week to the incomes of the Tsars. So if you ask me why did the Tsar pull out of the continental system which led to Napoleon invading Russia, the maps which were available suddenly seemed as if they may be incorrect. Along comes Father Martini, following in the footsteps of Father Ricci in China. I regard Martini as a hero of mine. How a man, in a period of a decade, not much more, could walk around China, go to Europe, present Johann Blau with his manuscript maps, just from his own personal observation, in that short period of time. I've lived in Manila for 21 years now, and I can't draw a map of Manila, let alone this guy basically walked around China and provided the manuscript maps to the great new atlas of China that Blau produced in 1665? Four. Thank you. Amazing, absolutely amazing. Now let's just briefly look at Martini. A young Italian, a brave man, stood up to the Manchus when they invaded, and according to his biographer, a bit of a trencher man who liked his food and drink. And in 1651, he had to present to His Holiness in Rome a proposal for a special Chinese liturgy, which involved incorporating Chinese elements into the Catholic Church's masses. So he hitched a ride to Manila, and that is the only point in my lecture where the Philippines gets mentioned and I am relevant to the theme of this conference. And from Manila he got on a Norwegian private vessel which took him to Bergen, and he slowly worked his way through Europe, and in passing through Leyden, as I mentioned, he visited the garden of Mr. Just Nobila, and he said that is the true rhubarb, which was mentioned before. But in addition, far more importantly for cartophiles, he presented his manuscript maps to Johann Blau. Johann Blau and his father had worked on a various set of maps for some years, and in 1640 they produced this map of Tartaria. And by the way, nearly all the rhubarb in the world until 1640 came from Tartaria, not from China. Tartaria lay outside the boundaries of what was then China. Okay. And there you are, in 1640, there's Blau's map, which is a rather nice map. I think this is nice because I can't blow it up, but here, oops, just here, the little devils scampering about with little wings and forked tails and so forth. And actually, I have some sympathy with that. Cartographers are often criticized for putting animals in places where they shouldn't be. But if you follow that, who's that gentleman who wrote something for British Library about 3 years ago? Van Duzer? Jeff Van Duzer. I like his argument. And the reason I like it is because those demons actually make sense. Because to this day, at that point where Blau has his demons, the big tourist attraction of Dunhuang in northwest China, the Whispering Dunes. They call them the Singing or the Whispering Dunes to the tens of thousands of tourists who go there, as I did last year. And these are the very same dunes that gave the whistling noises that European travelers thought were the whispering of the devils. So the actual appearance of the demons there is not irrelevant, as it might be thought at first. However, the main point about this is as follows. Johann Blau in 1640 produced this map of China, which is actually of Tartaria, which geographically is pretty hopeless. It's a nice map to collect, but the rivers aren't in the right places. There's many things wrong with it. Compare his Yellow River with that of a map drawn by the Chinese themselves 500 years earlier. The Huanghe, almost exactly correct on that 1137 map, which Europeans didn't know about until A. Purchas produced his map from a Chinese source, and Father Ritchie drew the Huanghe correctly in his 1605 map of the world, which only the Chinese really knew about, other than the Jesuits. This, in 1656, was the Mattioli picture of rhubarb. 10 years later, Martini had changed the picture of rhubarb to an accurate one. This is the medicinal rhubarb Rhum palmatum, not the ones we eat. But that is an accurate picture of Rhum palmatum. And it was due to Martini seeing this growing in Leyden that we have that picture. And more importantly to cartographers, Martini Blau 1655, Shenxi province. Here we have where every cartographer for 100 years had got rhubarb grows here, no imps, no rhubarb, no sochia. And after that, every decent, respectable European cartographer followed Martini's and Blau's map. One or two miscreants like Carol Allard, as late as 1690, showed rhubarb grows here, but not many. And if anybody knows of anybody who a post-1680 map which says this is where rhubarb grows, let me know, please. But in other words, Martini made an accurate map, but it's boring. Isn't that boring, really? I mean, it's interesting, but which would you buy? Which would you buy? Would you buy that one? Or that one? I don't know. I know which one I would buy. This is almost a guide. You can use that to this day, more or less. It's fairly accurate for rivers. Okay. This had consequences. Martini rubbed rhubarb off the map. And the consequence was this. During the whole of the 18th century, when rhubarb sales in medicine in Europe were at their height, worth millions and millions and millions of dollars every month to the economies of Western Europe as the basic medicine. Somebody mentioned Gothic horror this morning. Jane Austen, Northanger Abbey. Northanger Abbey is a Gothic novel. And she says, but surely you cannot buy poison in every pharmacist in Britain, just like rhubarb. You could buy rhubarb in every chemist shop in Britain and across Europe. It was the chief medicine. It was no longer shown on the maps. But the botanists wanted to find it, and they couldn't find it, because now they had a choice between inaccurate old maps saying where rhubarb was and accurate new maps which didn't say where it was. So Linnaeus himself was completely baffled by it. One of Linnaeus' great failures was his classification of rhubarbs. And for the Americans here, by the way, don't believe that Ben Franklin introduced rhubarb to America. He didn't. A man called Peter Collinson, a London botanist, sent some seeds to John Bartram, the father of American botany, in 1737. And we know that John Bartram grew that rhubarb. We know it because in 1739, Peter Collinson wrote to John Bartram and said, here's how to bake rhubarb pie. The first rhubarb pie recipe I've ever been able to find was in 1739, 30 years before Ben Franklin sent rhubarb to his friends in America. However, the point is we now have an accurate map, but unfortunately, at the very moment that the botanists need this information, it vanishes from the map. And now lastly, you'll be pleased to hear, Martini, having succeeded in his liturgical mission to Rome, came back to Hangzhou, and got cholera. And according to his biographer, David Mungello, who has seen the papers that I have not seen, which appear to be in the University of Glasgow's archives, his fellow Jesuits reported that he ignored the advice of a local Chinese doctor and doctored himself and died. This is the sinister part of an overdose of rhubarb. Rhubarb had its revenge. Martini scrubbed it off the map. Rhubarb returned the favour, according to the documents available. That is weird, isn't it? Is rhubarb some sort of sentient being that, as Peter Collinson said in his recipe for rhubarb tart to John Bartram, best eaten cold? No. Now that's the sinister part, but there's a big but at the end of all this. Rhubarb has killed lots of people, or rather stupid people have killed themselves by mis-eating rhubarb. Rhubarb may well have been involved as an accessory in the Black Death. It certainly was involved in the death of thousands of people in Britain in the 19th century, because they would go to the equivalent to Mercury drugstore and they would ask for, can I have 3 penneth of rhubarb, please? But because rhubarb was such a commonly in demand, and the only thing as commonly in demand was opium, which you will remember Commissioner Lynn said you don't use in Britain, but he was wrong, the chemists would often mix up the two. And some old lady who wanted to relieve her bowels would find herself poisoned to death with laudanum. And literally thousands of people died that way. So rhubarb was implicated there. In the First World War, hundreds of people died in Britain when stupid people at the Ministry of Defence and the Ministry of Agriculture suggested to them that they might like to try rhubarb leaves as an alternative to spinach. Rhubarb leaves are poisonous. By the way, Jefferson, the famous Thomas Jefferson, even suggested to his friends in America that they should try spinach. I suspect they might have been his political opponents. But anyway, rhubarb has been involved in many deaths, but I have never come across, in 50 years research into rhubarb's history, come across anybody who died of an overdose of rhubarb, which would raise the question, if he didn't die that way, how did Martini die? And why was this story about his death concocted? It's a very nice story. It's a beautifully complete story, because rhubarb does to Martini what Martini did to rhubarb. But I don't actually think it's true. Thank you. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer them. Okay, in small doses it cures constipation. Thank you. In small doses it cures constipation. In large doses it cures diarrhea. And if you consider what the diets and health of Europeans was for 400 or 500 years, I would imagine almost everybody was suffering from one or two of those ailments for hundreds of years. It was in enormous demand. It was also recommended as a recipe for piles, by the way, but that was a minor. But to this day, most travellers' tummy bug are based, tummy bug drugs, to get rid of the curse of Montezuma and so forth, they are based on chemical replacements for the anthraquinones found in rhubarb roots. That's what it was used for.
Thank you very much. It's a great talk. I'm over here. Where does the origin of the word rhubarb, meaning untruth, come from? This is someone speaking rhubarb, they're talking rubbish or something like that.
Because I think that they onomatopoeia, because it sounds like rubbish, rhubarb. And the Swedes also have the same sort of thing, because I'm not sure if there are any Swedish speakers, I think I'm right. They're called slums, rabarbakvata, which is a similar meaning. Rhubarb, rabarbakvata, unhealthy place, badly built. Yeah.
Can you kindly repeat what you said about the source of the maps? Was it Matteo Ricci's maps that were brought to Europe?
No. These were Martini's maps. He brought his manuscript maps and shared them with Johann Blau, and Blau produced the Novus Atlas Sinensis 1654.
And Martini's source was he drew himself?
Well, given that we know that, I can't really answer that question, but I'll try to. Given that we know that Samuel Purchas had got himself that wooden block from China, which was a very accurate map, it is quite likely, it seems to me, that a man of Martini's initiative and his sense of adventure and the way he wandered around the country would have come across many indigenous maps of China and used those in it. But it seems to me that a lot of it was from his personal observation of walking around China, moving around China and taking notes on what he saw. Anything else? I apologize, look, if this was light, okay? I know it's a bit light. And I probably said one or two things that are a bit over the top. But I will use any audience to push my favorite fruit. Anything else? Yes.
First I want to tell you that since I don't know that many cartographers, I'm still learning them. When you started this, I did actually think you were going to get around to talking about making a rhubarb martini. So, there you go. And now that I understand it, I'm trying to understand, based on North American things, I got to believe this stuff will grow all over England. What was so hard to get? It's not like it was tea. What was so hard to get it over?
Well, the difficulty was for the medicinal rhubarb. The quality of the medical qualities, the medical powers of the root seemed to have depended on the manner in which it was cured and how it was cured and how, because it was a lengthy process of curing in Tartary. The other thing was, rhubarb is a fantastic number of varieties. I went into a shed in my home area in northern England about three years ago, which is run by a Yorkshireman and his Dutch wife, and there are 700 varieties of rhubarb. That's aside from the 150 species of rhubarb that exist. Rhubarb is a hermaphroditic plant which never grows true to seed. If you want to grow rhubarb true to the parent plant, you must take a piece of the root. This is disadvantageous in one respect, but enormously advantageous for the plant, because it means it can evolve very quickly and adapt to a new environment. So you're quite right, it grows everywhere. Yeah. But the key issue was finding the one that had the same medical qualities as the one that came from Tartary. Anything else? No, good. Oh, you have one there, the last one.
Thank you so much. It really has been very enlightening. The first overseas IMCOS symposium was in Amsterdam, and I remember seeing these beautiful Blau atlases, white leather, tooled in gold, and I know, well, Hans Koch would probably tell you where they were, but it was at a wonderful library in Amsterdam, and I'm sure Martini must have helped Blau produce those atlases. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson, for a wonderfully entertaining topic on rhubarb. I don't know how many of you were similar to me when I was growing up. I used to read these comic books by Goscinny and Uderzo, Asterix. I read the English version, of course, and when Asterix's friend Obelix would sulk and go away, he would mutter to himself, rhubarb, 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 rhubarb. So this is quite an interesting thing. Many of you know our next speaker, Mr. Hans Koch. He is chairman of the IMCOS Executive Committee. Mr. Koch, formerly with the KLM Royal Dutch Airlines, retired from active flying in 1996 as captain on Boeing 747-400s. Flying over oceans and polar areas sparked an interest in navigation and maps. Mr. Koch collects maps and charts from mainly Dutch cartographers from the period 1560 to 1800. His interest also extends to maps of Japan by both Western and European cartographers. Mr. Koch is on the board of editors of the Dutch magazine Kaarttrezuur, a journal on the history of cartography in the Netherlands. He has also contributed to the History of Cartography project, mainly on aviation maps. Mr. Koch is co-author of the academic book, Sailing for the East, History and Catalogue of Manuscript Charts on Vellum of the Dutch East India Company, 1602 to 1799. To tell us more on the local exploration highlights in the days of the Dutch United East India Company, known as the VOC, may I present Mr. Hans Koch.
Ladies and gentlemen, the previous speaker
has talked me into not eating rhubarb, but drink martinis instead. Ladies and gentlemen, many thanks to the organizing committee for the invitation to speak on this conference. And when I was asked, Rudolf Litz asked whether I could insert a few words on Dutch Admiral von Spilbergen. At the time I replied that I would see what I could do, but when the presentation developed, it became clear to me that surveying trips from Batavia and Jakarta would be the topic rather than going to Manila Bay. Neither the Battle of Oliver van Noord versus Antonio de Borga in front of Manila Bay in 1600 am I going to mention, or the fact that the sunken San Diego was rediscovered near Fortune Islands in 1990. Most of its treasures are stored in the Museum of the Filipino People, I understand. And that Joris van Spilbergen returned for freeing Dutch Admiral Paulus van Carden, or to loot Spanish galleons in February 1616, will go unreported today. I promise that I will not mention van Spilbergen in any way, neither for completion of a world circumnavigation, nor for taking Le Maire halfway home to Holland as a VOC prisoner after he discovered the routing around Cape Horn in 1616. I will not mention any mischief of the Dutch in Manila Bay against the Spanish. But I will apologize to Rudolf for not heeding his request and creating him feelings of misery and grief. I have seen, by the way, that there is a debris exhibit in the exhibition related to that. Jokes apart, ladies and gentlemen, I am stealing your time and I need to return to the topic at hand as advertised. On Dutch exploration in the Far East, and particularly from Batavia, now Jakarta, as administrative center of the VOC in the Far East, and I'll talk a bit post-VOC also. This Plancius map shows what it was all about. Please note the depiction, not only of the spices, but also of the precious woods, the white, yellow, and red sandalwood. Precious woods that were ground at home in Holland by inmates of prisons and used as base for paints, medicine, and cosmetics. My next map is by Ortelius. It's also in the exhibition, I believe, but this is a 1595 version, and it shows that there was much to be discovered, surveyed, and corrected. Japan still in the shape of a kite, Formosa missing, Java too fat, no Teloctomini in Celebes, Halmahera is pretty good. New Guinea is a bit of a mess, really, but it's all state of the art. Petrus Plancius from Flanders, a driving force behind the initial Dutch efforts in the Far East, bought a number of charts from Lisbon, from Bartolomeu de Lasso in the 1590s. And he produced some of his own maps for the benefit of Dutch exploration and trade during the last decade of the 16th century, which is actually pre-VOC. Plancius actually is Platenvoet in Flemish, or flatfoot, but it is Latinized into Plancius. And I feel Johannes Coccius would sound a lot better than Hans Kok, but alas. When in 1602 the VOC was founded under political pressure, again Plancius supplied charts for navigation. It was a lucky fact that Gentleman 17, managing the VOC, decided to have a vertical organization, controlling the whole process of purchase, stocking, warehousing, transportation of goods by ship, building and equipping ships, and the sale at auction in the Netherlands. All was in the same company. That way, they had to establish the cartographic hydrographic office too, which was controlled by dedicated Dutch cartographers of high caliber, and which lasted the full 200 years of its VOC existence without any interruption. As sea charts and later fortification maps and maps for raising taxes and crop control were needed, a local cartographic office was created in Batavia. One reason for that being the phase lag in communication between the Netherlands and the Far East of over 1 year. This local cartographic outfit by no way was a small thing. At the height of its map production around 1740, some 55 cartographers and draftsmen were employed full-time there, supplying the vellum and paper maps and charts needed for local navigation in the Indonesian archipelago, also covering trips to Japan, to China, to India, Sri Lanka, the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, and of course the long voyages back home to Holland. We have on record a single shipment of no less than 3,000 empty parchment sheets from Holland to Batavia for chart making locally. Only after 1815, when the Netherlands all of a sudden became a colonial power, were cartography and surveying a government task, as the VOC had gone broke in 1799. Much more surveying was done by the Dutch in the large Indonesian archipelago than ever at home. Where VOC cartography covered navigation and coastlines mainly, the post-1815 period put more emphasis on inland cartography for the normal administrative reasons that apply in any country. Toponymy developed from seaside fuel names like Hen and Three Chickens, one larger island with three smaller ones close to it, and Stier's Head and Dwars in de Weg or across the road, to inland toponymy, slowly replacing Dutch names with local names in Bahasa, Malay or Sudanese as derived from the local population, turning Varkens Island into Pulau Babi and so on. Still, when the Dutch left Indonesia in 1949, 1957, and finally in 1962 from Western New Guinea, a large number of long-established Dutch names disappeared in favor of local names. Batavia becoming Jakarta again, probably a case in point, as is Western New Guinea becoming Irian Jaya and later Papua Barat. Well, back to the Batavia kaartenwinkel in Dutch or map shop. When charts were required for homebound journeys, they were updated locally in Batavia, initially a bit clumsily by navigation officers temporarily available off the incoming fleets. But later, the Batavia kaartenwinkel was established under the equipagemeester, master of ship supplies, who was tasked with supplying the returning vessels with all kinds of items, including navigation equipment. From 1615 onwards, governors-general in Batavia had been complaining that charts of better quality showing more details were required to safely facilitate VOC operations. More local draftsmen were employed, more and better cartographers were appointed, and continuity in the office required less dependency on arriving pilots, leading to more professional cartographers in full-time service. In 1668, the organization was adapted such that a baaskaartenmaker, a mapmaker-in-chief, was appointed, who was responsible for navigation equipment only, but still working under the equipagemeester. Through the years, much has depended on the governors-general in Batavia and their specific interest in navigation and their political coordination with VOC directors in Holland. On the slide you see the names of 4 governors-general that were most important in the quest for better charts. Jan Pieterszoon Koen, 2 times as a matter of fact, Hendrik Brouwer, Anthony van Diemen. Hendrik Brouwer had already talked the VOC into using a Brouwer route in 1611, and it was prescribed for use after 1615. The route from Cape Town, more or less along the 40th parallel south latitude, until passing the islands St. Paul and Amsterdam. Thereafter, course might be set to Sunda Straits, and the southeasterly trade winds would materialize and permit that course for square vessels. This route was materially shorter in time due to the strong westerly winds in combination with the ocean currents going east as well. This is a very interesting map. Actually, I would like to spend some more time on than I have available right now. But this map is a 1740 product by Ottens, Reinier Ottens. Well, here is his little cartouche. It is a derivative of the map 1701 by Halley, and he's showing the isogonals, the lines of positions with equal compass variation. But it also shows nicely the routes that were taken by the VOC ships to the Far East. You see here the yellow ones coming out of the channel all around Scotland, depending on the winds on departure in Holland, going to the Cape Verde Islands, crossing the equator, the doldrums at a specific delineated space which would give them the shortest time across. Sometimes they spend 3 weeks out here. Then, unable to go against the southeasterly winds to Cape Town, they had to go along the Brazilian coast until picking up the westerly winds into Cape Town. Thereafter, they would go this Brouwer route and turn to port, left that is, on various different spaces, depending on the winds. Here you see, for instance, a nice one going into Sunda Straits, either under Sumatra or under Java. I'll talk some more about it later. We have the same here for Ceylon and India, at different routes. The return route was different. In red, you see, it was more or less a direct one to the Cape. Then past St. Helena, because the ships were heavily laden, we didn't want to risk our cargo in the English Channel, because we have had 4 Anglo-Dutch wars. There were pirates there. We had war with the French every once in a while, so we would go safely across the north of Scotland. We would have ships waiting with the latest information, and ships would proceed either to a fjord in Bergen, Norway, and wait for the Navy to escort them home, or go directly home when it was considered safe. Back to the Garter shop. Apart from updating the existing charts with information gleaned from incoming ships' journals, copying sufficient numbers in manuscript from the Legger or master chart in the office for the returning fleets, the Katerwinkel in Batavia was tasked with coordinating the chart's content and changes thereto with the official VOC cartographers in the hydrography department at home in Amsterdam. As communication with Amsterdam took a very long time, the urge to become more independent became apparent, and the Raad van India, the Council of the Indies in Batavia, the local government more or less, ordered exploration and survey trips of their own. Sometimes on orders, and requests from Holland, but also instigated locally when the need for update of local charts became pressing. Let me get into a few examples now. We will talk about exploration trips to the south coast of Java, to the Southland or modern Australia, up north to Japan and beyond, and in the Indonesian archipelago in sequence from A to D. The south coast of Java was late being explored, as surf on the south coast was heavy. Reefs were protecting the coastline, making landfall difficult, and not much interior information via the land route was available as yet. Fleets from Holland, aiming for Sunda Straits, might end up on the Java south coast or more westerly under the coast of Sumatra. Meeting a coastline running east-west, then Java, and turning left to port for the strait, come up on a northwest-southeast oriented coast, meant Sumatra, and turning starboard or right for the strait. Both plans depending on the season, and intended to avoid difficult tacking against the wind on the last leg to Sunda Straits. Several exploration trips for the south coast of Java were undertaken, either via Sunda Straits counterclockwise or alternatively via Bali, Strait Bali, clockwise. The toponyms at the time clearly reflected the difficulties. All names obviously derived from a seaside appearance. No local names, no old Portuguese names at all. No Dos Irmãos, but Twee Gebroeders for 2 islands little apart. This slide lists and records the dates of ships, commanders and cartographers. Baaskaartenmakers, the mapmakers-in-chief, would often perform these tasks themselves in case surveying from a scheduled commercial trip were considered insufficient. The first trip mentioned in 1622 came to nothing. Dispatched to explore the Southland, they found the vessel Mauritius inbound from the Cape, lying helplessly on the south coast of Java. Ship and crew were in such bad shape that skipper Jan Vos decided to help and escort the ship back to Batavia, effectively ending his trip of exploration. In Amsterdam, the 1628 chart by Hessel Gerrits had thus to be made without any updates from this trip, although Hessel Gerrits had requested Batavia to arrange for it. In 1692, the trip was scheduled to escort the vessel Lek from Dirk de Vries Bay on the south coast, but surveying took place also, resulting in new maps. In 1698, Cornelis Coops did a complete circumnavigation clockwise of the island of Java, producing maps from its very east end to the very west, also searching for a missing ship, by the way. In 1711, another trip was scheduled, as Governor-General van Riebeek was not happy afterwards with Coops' maps and wanted better ones. The 1739 expedition also came about for political reasons, as Batavia feared that the English might try to get a foothold on Java's south coast. A beautiful chart resulted, and here you see it. It is a manuscript chart, 94 centimeters by 2 meters 14, quite a huge thing. It's kept in The Hague in the National Archives. And you see the south coast of Java, you see the coastal profiles, you see some bays that were also put in on a larger scale. And of course you have the scales in miles and so on. I have a detail on this one also. This is the south coast again, and here you see a close-up of the cartouche, which reads, this is a general paskaart, general plotting chart for the south coast of Java, and it is made in the year 1739, and the PP stands for Paulusson. He was a Scandinavian in the service of the VOC, actually. The north coast of Java was also repeatedly checked out, often in combination with commercial trips with destinations elsewhere. Gerrit de Haan, he was a baaskaartenmaker in Batavia, prepared a map of Java's north coast from Batavia to Rembang around 1750. With volcanoes to take bearings on, here you have Gunung Tagal, obviously active at the time because it has a smoke plume. This is a detail of the chart. You must bear in mind that north is at the lower side of it. On to B, the Southland exploration. Under this heading, we will discuss both intentional and accidental sightings. This is a list of intentional Hollandia Nova explorations. It would have boosted my national pride, ladies and gentlemen, to see the names of New Holland and New Zealand still in use today. You can't win them all, and 50% is not such a bad score, I guess. In 1606, a Dutch vessel named Duifken under Willem Jans and the Noordewijks van Roosegem explore the Australian coast. The vessel sailed south from New Guinea and passed Torres Strait without noticing that New Guinea and Australia were separated by a strait. In January 1616, the vessel Eendracht under Dirk Hartogs, it's not on my list because it was scheduled from Holland directly, left from Holland for Java. But it continued that Brouwer route to the east too long, and the crew went ashore on the west coast of Australia. To document the landfall, they flattened a pewter plate from the ship's galley and nailed it to a post as proof. Land of the Eendracht was the name of the land for a long time to come. Until 1620, a number of other chance sightings due to navigation errors occurred, leading the gentleman 17 in Holland to request Batavia to explore these lands further by sending a well-equipped ship for that purpose. In 1622, the vessels Arnhem, Pera and Wesel were prepared for an expedition. To keep that, I think this is the lower part of Professor Jackson's rhubarb chart. It's by Allard anyway, but I only put it up because it allows me to point out where this, here is Batavia, and they would either go here, and along this coast, and in the end I will be talking a little bit about Van Diemen, and we left the east coast of Australia for discovery for Captain Cook, who bears my name as a matter of fact, or I bear his. I will go back to the listing. The vessels Pera and Arnhem were actually dispatched in 1623 only. Now, I need to go back to the previous one. I want you to remember the trial rocks, these little things out there and out there, and the last viral, I can't really see it. The Pera and the Arnhem were actually dispatched in 1623 only, as I said, and after the shipwreck of the English vessel Trial in 1622 on the trial rocks. That emphasized the necessity for further charting. As a result, Carpentaria Bay was surveyed, and the premature return of the Arnhem due to leakage resulted in the discovery of Arnhem Land. The skipper of the Pera is still remembered by the name of the snow-capped mountain range in New Guinea, the Carstens Mountains. The Pera was to return along, according to instructions, along the same track as the outbound track, and so they made a double check on the coastline of the east side of the Carpentaria Bay. I have here the manuscript charts that came with the journal of the Pera, and you see the routing here going along the coast all the way down to here. Then there is no doubt a Cape Farewell or a Cape Keerweer, where they return along the same track. And I have a detail here where you can see it a bit more closer, and where you can also see most probably why they missed Torres Strait, because there is on the exit is a lot of sand being deposited by the Torres current, and a sensible captain would not probably risk his ship with this type of sandbank and prevailing easterly winds because of the little maneuvering room he would have that way. Here is the list again. In 1636, the Batavia government dispatched the ships Klein Amsterdam and Wesel to explore the lands east of Banda and go look for the Southland. But that trip along Australia's north coast again was not successful commercially. In 1642, Abel Tasman from Lutjegast in Groningen sailed first from Batavia to Mauritius under orders to start from there, driven by three objectives: find opportunities for potential trade, delineate the great unknown Southland, and establish whether a route to South America could be found passing to the south of Australia and New Guinea, as this area was still under the Dutch patent for the VOC, and we considered at the time that catching Spanish ships and the silver from Potosi Mountain in order to tighten the financial noose on the King of Spain seemed like a promising endeavor during our 80-year war with Spain, which lasted from 1568 until 1648. Actually, we have Admiral Piet Hein. He gave a good example at Matanzas Bay in Cuba in 1629, where he conquered what we call the Spanish Silver Fleet on its last homebound sector to Spain. And indeed, in 1648, it helped secure the Munster Peace Treaty and Holland's official independence from Spain. Tasman discovered Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania, in the process. It seems that Van Diemen's Land sounded too much like Land of Demons to become internationally acceptable. We continued more or less due east and arrived at the west coast of New Zealand's Southland, turning to the north, crossing Cook Strait to the North Island, and returned to Batavia in 1643 via the north coast of New Guinea, with little to report in terms of commercial potential. In 1644, Abel Tasman made his second trip of exploration, as the result of the first trip had displeased both Batavia and VOC Holland. He was ordered from Batavia to via Makassar and Amboina to Banda to further explore the south coast of New Guinea, try to establish whether New Guinea and Australia were separated by a strait or connected, and ordered to continue along the northwest coast of Australia to go all the way down along the coast of Western Australia to the Tropic of Capricorn before returning to Batavia. I have here Mr. Tasman on New Zealand's South Island in Nelson near the ferry, and when I took this photograph he had an empty can of Foster's in his bronze pocket. At the time I have replaced it by a can of Heineken. Here is my list again. In 96-97, another fleet under Willem de Vlaming started out from Amsterdam, set foot ashore again at the same spot as Dirk Hartogs had done in 1616, and they found his pewter plate. They brought it home to Holland, and they left another plate of theirs nailed down to the post, documenting their presence in turn. On this occasion also the land was found unfit for potential trade. The de Vlaming plate was found by a French expedition in 1800, and they were so nice to leave it there. Here, this is a very nice chart. It's one of my personal favorites, but I don't own it, regrettably. You see, this is the manuscript prepared by Willem de Vlaming. I have the map on the left and a detail turned by 90 degrees on the right. You see here the coast of the Zuidland, Freeport, the Southland. This area here is on the detail. Here is Dirk Hartogs Island. Here is where the plate was, and the pewter plate was, inscription point, I think they call it. And for free information, this is all good sand ground for anchoring. We also have a rot nest thing, which is fairly famous. It's in the south, it's hard, I have no detail of it. There were marsupials, small kangaroos, probably Robert Clancy knows better what they are, but the Dutch thought they were marmots or whatever. They called them rats, and in colloquial Holland at the time we called them rots. So the rot nest island is actually a rat nest island. I have another list for you, ladies and gentlemen. Probably too many lists for you, but this is a list of Hollandia Nova sightings by chance and navigation errors. As this slide shows, not only planned sightings took place, but navigational errors caused accidental sightings galore. I will not go into these with the exception of pointing out a 1629 Batavia. It was a very famous trip. The ship was called Batavia. It floundered on the Houtman Arroyos on the west coast of Australia. 200 people were strewn over several small islands. There were only a few women. There were a lot of people who wanted to go and become pirates. Small sloop was sent to Batavia for help. Nobody knew whether it ever would get there or whether the help would get there. But in the end, the ship came. 2 brave soldiers swam to the ship and warned it off because the other people wanted to conquer the ship and go as corsairs. So half of them were strung up on to denominate Van Diemen's Land of Tasmania in the south of Australia, but he also was to provide names for Strait Van Diemen up north and his wife Maria, also a few toponyms up there. Vries prepared this manuscript chart of the North, and please look as this one came with the journal. It's also an account of the company. I have another one which is attributed to Tim, but you can see from the same appearance that it must be Tim. This is the island of Ceram, further east, almost at New Guinea. And I have a detail there. If you look at the top here, you see a coastal profile, which is very nice, and I made a detail of it. You see here the coastal profile as it looks from about 2 miles out to sea. You see here a river, but that river depends to the plain map again. It's not part of the coastal profile, of course. And also please note there is a chain of depth soundings from one trip all along the coast. My narrative may seem to suggest a haphazard approach to surveying the area, but indeed it was a continuous effort by the Batavia staff of the department. I have prepared a list of the cartographers in charge of the office there over the years, and trust that you will conclude that serious surveying was considered a never-ending necessity. This list only covers the 17th century. I could easily draw up a list for the 18th century to be just as long and just as complete. Here I show you a map made by Abraham Anias in Holland. He was actually the cartographer of the chamber in Zealand of the VOC, and I took it because I can prove here that not everything was so nice about these trips. Here you see the detail near Makassar. Makassar is somewhere up here. It reads here, the Nieuwendam gebleven. This means a shipwreck by the vessel Nieuwendam. Here it says, the brik de Geit gebleven. That is a smaller ship, shipwrecked. I have a few more of these, but they're very hard to read. And I think I have, no, I'll give you the next one. Well, I must say, on Dutch charts you can find 3 expressions. Either ships are gebleven, they are gestoten, or they are genomen, which means they were either shipwrecked, they stayed at sea and never came back. They were gestoten, which meant they hit bottom but survived, probably in the lower part of a big wave or just during ebb tide. Or genomen means that they were conquered by pirates, and we include Spanish and Portuguese in the pirates happily, because I think most of our ships, apart from on the Malabar coast, there were a lot of pirates, but the ships that we lost in the East archipelago are mostly by Portuguese and Spanish. And another feature on this map is the detail to the left of the previous one, is what we would call a Heimwee archipelago. We're always short of names when we were sailing through wherever. And here you see there is an island Amsterdam, there is an island Middelburg, there is an island Medemblik. Here is this is nice too, a hen with his 4 chickens, 1 big island and 3 small ones. So, almost there, don't worry. I have one that is also in the exhibition. Here you can see that's the Victorian chart, 1753. The Royal family was becoming VOC official cartographer. And you see, although this is a sea chart, it's the eastern part of Java. I also have the western part. You see a profile of Batavia on the top with the castle here. The Pasar Ikan will be here nowadays, the piers. And you see there is a lot of interior detail now, not only maritime information. Whereas in the days of the VOC, surveying and map production understandably served the goals of the VOC only, after 1815 an increase of these activities was organized in order to serve the needs of a government to be. Emphasis shifted away from mainly maritime cartography to efforts aimed at administrative services and industrial capabilities, consequently favoring inland charting. Java was of most importance, and access was relatively easy via existing pathways in use by the population already. The outer positions were less easy to survey. In many places and islands, the sole access was upriver from the coast. Survey as practical, return to the coast, follow the coast, and go up the next river again. A number of exploratory trips were so completed. The ones up the river of Borneo, Kalimantan, were probably the most adventurous, as their journals prove. The often privately instigated surveys now serve the needs of railways, oil companies, or plantations and other private goals, as the government was in no way capable of catering to all needs initially. From 1860 onwards, government efforts were combined and coordinated as much as possible. The topographical services were placed under military general staff control in 1864. The Navy Hydrography Department at Surabaya was delivering stuff in combination and coordination. And they worked, of course, closely together with the services in Holland, also the Topographical Service and the Royal Netherlands Geographical Society. They organized a couple of surveying expeditions also. In the period 1855 to 1886, the Residentiekaarten, as we call them, residency charts of Java have been completed. The triangulation of Java was complete now. Their quality was much recognized and a number of international prizes were won. However, their readability and quality, also in view of their beautiful appearance and much praised relief height information, may have been excellent. The manufacturing process took so long that many of these splendid charts were unusable and obsolete by the time they arrived back in the archipelago from Holland. This is the Gunung Karang, and you see the relief information is very prominent and very clear also. Printing in those days had still to take place in the Netherlands. And on the Java side, production was delayed by engineers going on leave to the Netherlands or being relocated to other posts within the archipelago as the system prescribed. By 1905, all mapping services were coordinated and printing could be done in Batavia instead of in Holland. After 1910, the whole system would perform much better, also because surveying brigades were assembled from the Indonesian community or from properly trained local personnel. After 1920, Java was completely charted and work started in Sumatra, West Borneo, Kalimantan and Saleda, Sulawesi. After 1945, only the outer possessions were targeted, with Western New Guinea last in line. Between 1945 and 1949, surveys in Java came to a complete standstill, as the situation there was considered too dangerous because of the Indonesian struggle for independence. After 1949, more emphasis was placed on surveying Western New Guinea, the only remaining Dutch colony in the Far East. In 1962, this also came to an end, as Western New Guinea was transferred to Indonesia, although the Papuans definitely are a different breed of people altogether. President Sukarno was in need of distraction for domestic political reasons. The United States of America pressured the Dutch government to end the era of colonization for its own purpose, and the Netherlands were forced to withdraw, effectively terminating 350 years of presence in the archipelago, and with it 350 years of surveying and map-making came to an end. Personally, with hindsight that is always 2020, I much regret that after World War II, only Dutch Queen Wilhelmina was in favor of granting independence to Indonesia. Going our separate ways would then have been much more friendly and easier for both nations, and would have saved many lives on either side, quite apart from achieving more prosperity in a shorter period of time. Thank you.
Do we have questions for Mr. Kok? Oh, a lot of questions. Yes, Lian.
If in the 17th century there was nothing else than a big international trading company, the VOC, there was no Dutch government, of course. That only came about after 1815, after the Vienna Conference. Yes, that is a very interesting thing, actually. In The Hague, we have, in the National Archives, we have 4 kilometers of archives of records, only VOC. And a lot of them actually that's easy for cartographies. Surveys, the most of it you don't have to look at because it's only listing so many pounds of pepper, so many cents bought for this, sold for that, going to the market and that. But all in all, it's been digitized now. As a matter of fact, last year there was an exposition in The Hague commemorating the completion of 4 kilometers of digitation.
Thank you, Hans, for a very interesting talk. I just want to ask you a question about the exploration of the south coast of Java. So I noticed that in 1628, Gerritz had done a voyage to the south coast of Java to do some mapping of the south coast. But it took 64 years before the next mapping of the south coast. That seems a little bit surprising to me because this was towards the height, or at least a very lucrative period for the Dutch in Java and Indonesia. I'm a little bit surprised that it took them 64 years to do more mapping.
No, actually I tried to touch on it in my speech. The south coast was very hard to get to because of the reefs and the surf. And there was no commercial interest that we wanted to pursue out there. So we actually had no interest in the south coast at all until much later when we came from the north and arrived at the south coast on local ways.
Right.
And I'm sure that some ships have made reports on what they saw, some commercial ships. I was talking about the specific surveying trips, that's why they're so far apart. Some information has come on in the meantime, but it was none of our business to be there because we couldn't land ships there.
Right. I'll just make one very quick comment. As a person who's originally from Perth in Western Australia, I can assure you all that if you want to find a treasure, north of Perth, there is people who are still finding Dutch guilders in the sand dunes north of Perth today from those trips in the 1600s. So if you ever want to do some treasure hunting, that's the place to do it.
I think that's Fremantle. You even have a
north of Fremantle. Yeah, Jurien Bay.
Just the shift from a secretive mapping as represented by the secret VOC archives to a more open system. Did this coincide with the change in approach from mare clausum, or a closed sea approach, to a freedom of the seas, mare liberum, of which the Netherlands was an advocate?
What time period are you referring to?
No, I noticed that there's your VOC secret archives and the maps, right? Then they became more open in that the mapping was shared. Did that represent a shift in thinking in the Netherlands?
There is actually a misconception about VOC charts being secret. They may have, well, first of all, I have to point out that when the management declares it secret, it does not necessarily arrive at the working floor. Because if they say in Holland, in 1600, let's say, these maps are strategically important, we don't want the English or whoever to know about them, they're secret, that's fine. But if you talk 50 years later, you will see that a Dutch captain will sell his map to an English colleague who needs one, and vice versa. But legally, it still ought to be secret. Then you see that if the VOC goes on an exploration trip and finds nothing worthwhile in terms of trade and commerce, they will keep those maps in the office, but they're not secret. Only nobody will look at them because there is no reason to go there. So you will find very often, if you look at maps by others, for instance like Mr. Allard, which I showed, that they are much worse than that we know that the VOC knew already. But the VOC did not keep it secret. The VOC just let that map lie in the office and nobody had access to it. So there is a very long time for information to go through when there is no commercial interest. It normally goes fairly quickly outside the VOC because of all kinds of people talking about it when it is commercial of interest. Yes, please.
Mr. Cook, can I just ask, for all the explorations, who financed them from the 1600s? Are they all VOC financed explorations?
Yes, VOC is actually considered the first international blue chip company. It was financed on shares. As a matter of fact, 50% of the shares were the Amsterdam Chamber, 25 in the Zeeland Chamber, and 6.25% with Rotterdam, Delft, Hoorn, and Enkhuizen. And everywhere, that's why, may you recall, I mentioned the Gentleman 17. The shares being divided, I just pointed out, gave rise to the same division in management board. We had 8 from Amsterdam, 4 from Zealand, and 1 from the others, making it 16. Then, of course, the votes would maybe not be conclusive. So they added on a returning, on a revolving basis, a 17th member, well, any of these ones in turn, to make the Gentleman 17. So they could always make the decision, but no other money was coming in any VOC. It was plainly, and that's why they went broke in 1799, because the company became more and more corrupt. In 1780 to 1784, a big fleet was captured by the English, and they were already in bad shape. So in 1796 they stopped sailing. In 99 they went broke officially.
Sorry, I just have one more question. The cartographers, are they employees of the VOC or were they hired like an independent contractor?
Because the VOC was a vertical company, as I call it, they had their own people. The thing is that all the people in Batavia were in the service of the VOC, and in Amsterdam they had an official VOC cartographer who might have some business on the side, like Blaus had, for instance. But if you read in the archives, Blaus had to, everybody actually that was cartographer for the VOC had to sign that they would keep company business apart from their general business. It even sometimes prescribed that people that were making VOC charts were not allowed to work on others. And I know, for instance, of, what was it, 1631, when Hessel Gerrits died, before the funeral took place, the VOC directors were already there to grab the VOC charts that were in work.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Klopp. Very interesting talk. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming today. We have 45 minutes for lunch break. Note that the buses will leave from in front of the Ayala Museum at 1:35, which is 45 minutes from now. However, before we go, may we request the 4 speakers to come up for a photograph? Rolf, Liliana, and Richard, and Hans. Thank you. Thank you again. See you.